Let me just I'm muting my mic. Sorry about that. Let me just say good evening to you in Radio Land and in internet world at home and abroad. Thank you so much for choosing Q95 tonight. This is the Global View on Q. A warm welcome to all of you, all of our Q family listeners at home and globally. I'm Sheridan Gregoire, Mr. G. It's Tuesday, July 11, the 20th Tuesday of 2023, 8 p.m. at Q95, the big station. We're live on Facebook and also on YouTube. Follow us at Q95 FM Radio. The on-air phone numbers are on the homepage of our website at www.q95da.com. Please share the live, like our pages, get the latest breaking news and reviews as it happens, only on Q95, the big station. So as we continue tonight to revive the spirit of graciousness, love, and peace and prosperity and unity among our Kalinago and Afro-Caribbean brothers and sisters. And I'm joined, and I have to say I'm delighted to be joined by very distinguished guests, Dominica Freedom Party executive members, Bernardito political leader, Noelize Knight Didier, Alvin Thomas, and Johnson Boston. They will hopefully provide us with some insight and some specifics, or point to the lack thereof, from the final reports and draft electoral and campaign finance laws and regulations recommended by Sir Dennis Byron, and more recently, of course, by Dominica's own very trusted Justice, Dr. Irving Andre. And I'm sure that my distinguished guests will also speak to prospects for Dominica's future economy under good governance. Justice Dr. Andre, as you can recall, was asked during the Global View on Q on 20th June 2023 to compile a list of specific recommendations that will help to focus on some reasonable ideas and provisions for laws, for regulations, constitutional amendments, and the like that will square up with what most right-thinking Dominicans want to see in the revised electoral and campaign finance laws, for reconstituted electoral commission and strong independent chief elections officer who will function at and enforce the law, the rule of law without fear of favor, free from political influence from any incumbent administration and from other political forces. But in just 1 week, Justice Dr. Irving Andre delivered his report with recommendations in sharp contrast to Sir Dennis Byron, who was paid somewhere in the region of $650,000 plus to deliver a report and recommendations in 3 months, but he was only able to do so after about 3 years for whatever reasons. But Sir Dennis Byron did produce these 4 draft laws for consideration: the House of Assembly Elections Bill 2023, the House of Assembly Electors Regulations, the House of Assembly Election Petition Rules 2023, and the Electoral Commission Bill 2023. The question remains, what did Sir Dennis Byron really deliver for $650,000? My guess, and I'm delighted to know that we have a very, very distinguished attorney in the house with us tonight. We'll hear from her. Delighted to have her with us tonight. This lady has been elevated to the prominent rank of the leader of the bar, President of the Bar Association. We want to extend our warmest heartfelt congratulations to her for achieving that accolade. So I hope that my guests will consider and make some specific recommendations as to what they believe are imperative provisions in the law that are more applicable to Dominica's needs in order to bring about a more level playing field and free and fair elections that will help stabilize our democracy and quell anyone's notion to make Dominica a one party state at the whims and fancies of any future wannabe dictator. And I expect they will, in fact, make some recommendations to ensure that our electoral reform is in no way a prophecy of gloom and doom, as some people are fearing now. That electoral reform could be ground zero for Dominica's future, and we hope that it will be a turning point. That Dominicans will not be repulsed by what may be brewing. Who knows what may be brewing? That electoral reform is not a curse that will destroy Dominica, and that Dominicans get what they need and guarantee that they get it soon. That Dominicans firmly apply the cure for the electoral diseases and save their nation island, the nature island, for the future generations. So I am sure that my guest tonight, my very distinguished guest, will try the very best, provide reform recommendations with which the majority of Dominicans can feel comfortable enough to create a petition and affix the thousands of signatures to it and demand that the government pass the desired reform laws in Parliament. I believe Dr. Andre posited that several reasons why patriotic Dominicans, irrespective of the political affiliation, should reject what may what many allege as Byron's prescriptions for a dictatorship and a perpetual rule of the current administration, rather in accordance with the best practices in the Caribbean concerning free and fair elections, the recommendations of international organizations such as the United Nations and the OAS, and the warning issued, of course, by our CCJ. In that light, Dr. Andy recommended the following elements of free and fair elections as requisites to preserve Dominica's democracy, listed in no specific order priority. I believe Lambi may have queued up just to remind our audience and our guests of what Dr. Andre had said. It's just a short audio clip. I will now ask Lambi if he has that queued up. You let me know, Lambi, to play Dr. Andre's presentation. Just refresh our memories on his recommendations for the reforms in questions, and we will begin the conversation on the other side after Dr. Andre's clip is here. So over to you, Lambi.
Citizens exploring free and fair elections in Dominica. A proposal regarding electoral reform. On March 27, 2008, a senior counsel and close ally of Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit sent an email to Prime Minister Skerrit warning him of the madness going on at the Electoral Commission and the grave threat to Skerrit's quote-unquote electoral winning legacy, end of quote, if the Electoral Commission cleaned its bloated voters list and introduced voter identification cards. Thereupon, the Prime Minister refused to grant the Commission funds to obtain voter ID cards and replaced two members of the Commission with two of his legal cronies. In ensuing years, the Skerrit government refused to accept recommendations from local, regional, and international organizations, and even from a regional attorney who is the current Prime Minister of Barbados to make Dominica's elections free and fair. In July 2022, the Caribbean Court of Justice, Dominica's finest appellate court, cautioned that there should be no further elections in Dominica with the tints of the 2019 general election. Despite this warning, Mr. Skerrit called a snap election in 2022 with all the taints, illegalities, and irregularities that had contaminated elections in Dominica since 2005. In December 2020, the Prime Minister cherry-picked Sir Dennis Byron, a former head of the CCJ, to recommend changes to our electoral laws. After 3 years, Sir Byron has delivered, in exchange for over 600,000 silver dollars, reforms that Mr. Skerrit has been searching for all over the democratic world without success. So Byron had to symbolically dive deep and far in an ocean where no electoral expert had gone before, where no light of democracy shines, to surface with the Titanic of rusting reforms that will destroy Dominica's democracy and instead create a skeritocracy with red carpets leading to mansions, banks, shady convicted ambassadors, and incomplete or empty hotels. The critical features of Sir Byron's final report include the following provisions that will allow Mr. Skerritt to conduct elections in the same manner that he has done before, contrary to the caution of the CCJ, but without any accusations of illegality or unlawfulness. Overseas registration of voters. No specific indication that paying for the air and sea travel of persons to come to Dominica to vote for the candidate or political party constitutes the offense of bribery. No meaningful limitation on electoral expenditure. Such expenditure can be increased at the whims and fancies of the Commission and Parliament. Limited access to state media by opposition parties, and no access to private owned media. The provision for a national ID card rather than a voter ID card with biometric data. No specific indication of the biometric information that the ID cards should contain. Allowing Dominicans resident abroad to vote in Dominica if they visited the island for 90 days over a 5-year period. Placing faith in the Chief Electoral Officer and Chairman of the Commission to ensure the financial independence of the Commission or compliance with the proposed reforms. Finally, allowing sellers of Dominican passports who are beholden to the government to sit as chairperson and members of the Electoral Commission at the behest of the President and the political party in power. The Byron recommendations amount to nothing more than a recipe to continue holding elections in the very same way that concerned the CCJ in July 2022, despite the pious invocation of God by Dominica's leadership. It normalizes corruption in the holding of elections in Dominica and effectively ensures the catastrophic implosion of Dominica's democracy. For these reasons, patriotic Dominicans, irrespective of their political affiliation, should reject Sir Byron's prescription for a dictatorship and perpetual rule of the current administration. Rather, in accordance with the best practices in the Caribbean concerning free and fair elections, the recommendations of international organizations and the Organization of American States, and the warning issued by the CCJ, we recommend the following elements of free and fair elections that are required to preserve Dominica's democracy. There is no significance to the order in which these proposals are made. 1. Fixed dates for general elections enshrined in the Constitution. 2. The Constitution should provide for a system of elections based on the first past the post system, as we currently have, to one which incorporates a limited form of proportional representation along the lines set out in the February 1999 Constitution Review Commission report of the late Justice Telford Judges. A prime minister should serve only 2 consecutive terms of office and should be elected by all of the electors in a general election. There should be a new process of re-registration of voters and only in Dominica. Subject to paragraph 6, only those persons who are ordinarily resident in Dominica for a fixed period before an election should be eligible to vote in elections in Dominica. 6. Dominicans in the diaspora who meet certain established criteria to vote shall be able to do so in 1 or 2 designated virtual constituencies in Dominica, but not in the other constituencies where Dominicans who are ordinarily resident in Dominica are eligible to vote. 7. There should be a specific national voter ID card issued to all eligible voters in Dominica with biometric data, including fingerprinting. 8. There should be no overseas registration of voters. 9. There should be a fixed timetable for the cleansing of the voters list. 10. All political parties should have equal access to both state and privately owned media in Dominica during an election period. 11. There should be fixed limits on campaign financing expenditure, both before and during any reporting period stipulated in the applicable legislation. 12. Foreign persons, companies, or governments should be expressly prohibited from contributing either directly or indirectly to any candidate or party during a general election. 13, there should be fixed limits on the amount of money that a Dominican or local company can contribute to the election campaign of any candidate or political party. No foreign company which is domiciled in Dominica for the purposes of these reforms proposals shall be considered a local company. 14, the definition of bribery in the applicable election legislation should specifically include the paying for the air or sea travel for persons for the express or implied purpose of having that person or persons vote for a candidate or political party during an election. 15, the appointment of a special prosecutor rather than the director of public prosecutions to prosecute persons who violate Dominica's electoral laws. In the case of election petitions, the DPP's discretion to nullify any prosecution should be eliminated. 16. Any breach of the electoral laws is punishable not only by a fine or imprisonment, but also by disqualifying any candidate found guilty of violating Dominica's electoral laws. 17. The financing of the Electoral Commission by a duly constituted independent body rather than by the Minister of Finance or by Parliament. The Constitution should specifically provide for this, along with the fixing of a minimum sum of money to be provided to the Commission for the execution of its duties. 18. Persons in a clear conflict of interest, arising, for example, from the sale of passports or providing professional services to the government for consideration, other than their work as a member of the Commission, should be automatically disqualified from serving as a member of the Commission. 19. The Electoral Commission should be expanded to 9 members with civil organizations such as the religious sector, the business sector, trade union sector, and the local bar nominating a member on the Commission, with such nominee being appointed by the President to sit on the Commission. 20. The leaders of the political parties shall participate in at least 3 national debates during the 3 months preceding the general election. The other candidates shall participate in at least 1 debate during the 3 months preceding the general election. Consultations that do not involve many or most of these basic tenets of free and fair elections will constitute nothing more than a colossal waste of time. What, in heaven's name, make you think that Mr. Skerritt will agree to any meaningful reform, such as cleansing the voters' list, issuing voter ID cards with fingerprinting and facial recognition, setting a limit to 2 consecutive terms in office, or criminalizing the act of paying for voters to come to Dominica to vote for you, when he has turned his back on these very reforms for over 15 years? It is grimly ironic that the man whose electoral reforms are being hugged with great love and affection because of their tremendous potential to preserve the electoral legacy of the Prime Minister or to guarantee a Labour Party victory every electoral cycle is an eminent Caribbean jurist whose ancestors were once slaves. However, rather than focus on the cloven hoof of electoral manipulation, let those who thirst for righteousness and free and fair elections heed the words of Galatians 5:1. Quote, stand firm and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. I thank you.
Well, and thank you for that, Dr. Andre. I just thought it would be good for us to just remind ourselves and our listeners at home and worldwide of what Dr. Andre had recommended in the short space of time that he did this brief exercise. So, meantime, I'm sure of course, my guests and our listeners have heard or read on Q9, have heard on Q95 or read yourself, or have seen and read the letter which was addressed to Mr. Skerritt by Sir Dennis Byron when he submitted his final report on that reform consultancy. So having heard Dr. Andre, I'm sure that my distinguished guests will make the case for ensuring that the people of Dominica get appropriate reforms in the legislation that goes to Parliament to create a level playing field for free and fair elections, secure good, accountable, and transparent governance, and fortify our country's democracy. My distinguished guest, I'm sure, will also help us unravel and demystify these imperatives for reformed electoral and campaign finance laws and regulations for Dominica, and also to present the views of the Dominica Freedom Party so that Dominicans can all sing from the same hymn sheet, hopefully, going forward to secure the demand for free and fair elections and to strengthen the democracy. But meantime, Dr. Andre did strongly suggest the dismissal of the current process, wherein one of the political parties, the DLP, through its leader, Mr. Skerritt, and his handpicked appointee, Dr. Kenneth Darrow, an elected DLP official, candidate, wants to take the lead to spearhead the national process of electoral and campaign finance reforms that he stalled years ago, when in response to an email addressed to him by his attorney and spokesman, attorney Anthony Astafan, he stalled that the same reform process that the Electoral Commission had already initiated to cleanse the voters list and introduce voter ID cards for re-registered electors in Dominica. That email, in fact, as you can recall, to Mr. Skirt contained words to the effect that there was madness going on at the Electoral Commission, which would negatively affect his election winning legacy. And we all know that almost immediately thereafter, two members of the Electoral Commission who were representing the Dominica Labour Party on the commission were removed, and today there are three passport sellers who now essentially represent the DLP interests on the commission. And the electoral reform process is stalled. At least it was stalled until now. It looked like it's resuming again. I'm informed that the machine that had been purchased to issue voter ID cards may still be sitting around somewhere in Dominica. The necessary funds that were required were not made available for the advancement of that reform process, and thousands of people, many of whom have been dead for probably over 20 years, are still on the voters list. Question is, why are their names still there on the voters on the list of electors? And have dead people been voting in Dominica's elections? So please, our favorite listeners, or very cherished listeners, please stay tuned for another exciting, informative, and insightful Global View on Q show. I'm delighted to host my very distinguished guests, Dominican Freedom Party executive members, Bernardito, political leader, Noelize Knight Didier, Alvin Thomas, and Johnson Boston. Wherever you are in Dominica, in the region, and globally, please stay tuned. Tell your friends, join the conversation, get the answers to your questions. Be part of the solution. And as usual, we want to just extend from all of my guests here a huge shout out, hugs, much love, appreciation, a big thank you to our healthcare providers, our frontline workers, police and fire officers, teachers, doctors, nurses, and all the public and private sector personnel. We welcome every Dominican, a friend of Dominica. We embrace you wherever you are tonight, in every nook and cranny, in every village, every community in Dominica, in the region and globally. Thank you again, Sherwin, for keeping us on the air. And thank you, Lambi, on the console on Q95 tonight, directing the traffic. We will take our listeners' calls a little later because, you know, the people's voice is always a priority. So please call us a little later. Let's get started. I go now to you, Mr. Bernardito, political leader of the Dominica Freedom Party, to get the ball rolling, to help us determine where we go from here, to bring about a level playing field and the free and fair elections that will help stabilize the democracy and quell any notions, as I said before, of making Dominica a one-party state at the whims and fancies of any future wannabe dictator. To sustain our democracy, build our economy, improve lives and livelihoods, and take the people of Dominica out of what appears to be a never-ending cycle of poverty and mendicancy that we are witnesses. So please unmute your mic, Mr. Bernardito. You get the first word.
All right. Very good, Mr. G. Good evening to you, of course. Good evening to my fellow panelists, my executive members, my chairman, Mr. Boston, and two of my executive members on the DFP executive, Noelize and Alvin. And of course, a warm welcome to all our listeners, both on the airwaves as well as online. I know lots of folks are always interested in joining us really from every corner of the globe. So Your program, your station does an invaluable service in the pursuit and the maintenance of democracy. It's very important. And we're honored, happy, always pleased to be on the program, to join in that united front to preserve our democracy and our country and to create prosperity in our country. Is a mission, I think, that the DFP, most of the opposition parties, almost all the opposition parties, forces really, and yourself and those interested in democracy and freedom support. So we are glad to be here this evening to be part of the mix to continue the discussion. The DFP's position, we have had some discussions on this elsewhere, other forums and so forth, is really based on three principles, I think, or several principles, three main ones. It's really based on the notion of fairness, fairness not only to the Dominican residents at home, but also fairness, frankly, to the Dominican residents who live abroad. And fairness to the Dominican people in general, the citizenry, and fairness that we all have an equal opportunity to participate in living the type of lives that we want to live, which necessitates that we live in a free and fair democracy. The other principle is innovation. The Dominican Freedom Party believes that things evolve, life evolves, society evolves, we advance forward, and without a certain amount of innovation and creativity, we are stagnating. And in this day and age, stagnating means falling behind and worse, deteriorating. To simply sometimes keep up with the world, you have to innovate. And so innovation, creativity is one of the principles that the DFP supports when it comes to electoral reform in Dominica. The third principle around our position is that of pragmatism. The DFP has frankly always been a center-right party, a pragmatic party that tries to balance the conversation, try to balance the issues, and try to deliver a pragmatic, mature, considered position on all those issues. And that is the same position in terms of the philosophy of the Freedom Party that we embrace in this particular issue of electoral reform. So we embrace pragmatism. And the third and final principle of our position is that of cooperation. We fully believe that in order for us to achieve our goals, when I say us, I mean Dominican citizens, our Dominican nation, to accomplish our goals, we must have cooperation. And in particular, we must have now, in these dire times, strong cooperation and alignment between opposition forces who wish to see a new beginning, a renaissance of our democracy, a renaissance of our country. Cooperation is very important. And so that's really the principles upon which myself and my executive and my party and all of us have really spent the time to think through this issue, to digest the legislation, to debate internally, to arrive at a position that we think embraces those values that we think are central to the Dominican Freedom Party. So in that framing net principle of those things, the Dominican Freedom Party takes a bit more, and there is nothing. Let me preface this. We need to realize, I think, in this debate, especially the sensitive debates of electoral reform and many other issues, which we need to approach as a united opposition force, that there is nothing intrinsically wrong with some level of difference of perspective on those things. That, in fact, if we did not have a healthy level of different perspectives, that we would simply have an echo chamber, or we would simply have groupthink, which almost certainly guarantees a less optimal outcome than a robust discussion around healthy dialogue, healthy debate about the best approach to move our country democracy forward. And so there is nothing wrong, and I would encourage and hope that we as a general public and we as political parties and as opposition forces do have some differences and different perspectives on how best we can come together, how best we can achieve the objective. But having those different perspectives, of course, requires us to have healthy dialogue to arrive at a position, a common position that we know will move the ball forward rather than backward or stagnate the issue as it stands today. And so that is really the position of the Dominican Freedom Party. Our particular perspective might be slightly different from that necessarily that has been articulated in the clip that was played. We believe that in many of the principles that have been outlined, not only by Dr. Andre, but many of our colleagues in the ERC and so on, we are firmly of the conviction that there are many flaws in this legislation that must be addressed if we are to get an electoral outcome, electoral legislation that moves our democracy and strengthens our democracy and protects our democracy. There are many flaws, many loopholes, many openings that need to be addressed in this legislation in order for us to move forward. However, many people have put in a lot of effort, and I'm not talking simply this consultancy, Dominicans over many years, into getting some level of electoral reform passed. Many folks have made a lot of effort to ensure that we make progress in this regard. And I think, given that legacy, given that effort, given that push, that we owe it to ourselves and to the nation to truly put in the hard work to fully digest the legislation that is proposed, to understand what in that legislation advances the cause forward, to fully understand where the gaps lie in that legislation, and to fully commit ourselves to closing those gaps and improving that legislation so that if and when that legislation is passed, we have accomplished the goal of moving the democracy forward. That is one thing. The other aspect of this is the Dominican Freedom Party, as I said, we are pragmatic. We have taken a pragmatic approach to this. We understand and we embrace and are not afraid to shy away from the need, often, of phased approaches to progress. Given the importance, the delicacy, the far-reaching nature of electoral reform, we believe that a staged approach to reform is acceptable. For example, there are elements that have been called for and asked for that we fully believe in. We fully believe in limited terms for a prime minister. We fully believe in aspects of fixed dates for elections to reduce the influence of snap elections. Those are principles that the Dominican Freedom is firmly behind and support and believe in. However, as we said, some of those issues we believe can be dealt with in a phased manner as we move forward in the election and may not necessarily be, principles, issues that we necessarily try to accomplish in one shot at the beginning. So the pragmatic approach which we recommend is simply that we look at this legislation in detail. We understand what, if there are incremental improvements that move the ball forward, identify the gaps, and we know, as I've said, we're fully aligned with the analysis that there are many gaps that are inadequately addressed in this legislation. To fully look at those gaps, to address those gaps, to help draft legislation to close those gaps so that the Dominican public receives some legislation that does, in fact, in a tangible way, move the ball forward. Now, if the passage of this legislation impedes, enhances, as was said, the furtherance of a dictatorship in our island, then that is unacceptable. If the legislation is salvageable and does in fact move the democracy forward in a tangible way that we can accept as a cooperative endeavor in the opposition, then I believe we owe it to ourselves and the public to do the hard work it is to make the legislation work in our best interest. Um, the other issues, as I said, is, you know, we need to do a little bit of work in the technology space, embrace that. I think a lot of the shortcomings, a lot of the debate, a lot of the problems that can be identified have solutions today that were not available before. And we can embrace that approach, I think, to drive the conversation and to drive the solution forward. We are a solutions oriented party first and foremost, pragmatic in our approach, and willing to work with all groups so that we get a sort of democratic uh, solidification and reform that we're looking at. And so I won't hog the time too much. What I would like to do, having framed the issue in terms of phased approaches, pragmatic approaches, a willingness to be open and innovative and seek solutions. Having framed our approach in those general terms, I will allow and ask, and we'll go back and forth, Mr. G, as you see fit. But the other members of my executive will expand on a couple of ideas, some key areas that we want to discuss in the spirit, as I said, of that general framework that I just outlined. So I will stop there, and then we will get a little into it. Next up, based on how you want to reach, I'd like to bring in Miss Knight Didier to talk a little bit about the issue of lists and the issue of clean lists and how we go about looking at, as I said, from that framework that I painted. So back to you, Mr. G, and take it away.
I particularly like the way you framed it. You've laid the foundation. You put the position of the Freedom Party, the big position, the overview, the global view of the whole thing. And I like the way you put forward the philosophy. You've laid the foundation very nicely. And but I think you're quite right. We are very fortunate tonight to have a very distinguished attorney with us. We don't have to, you and I don't have to go and toil with the idea of trying to put those things in this legal jargon, because we know we have somebody we can depend on to do that for us tonight, Bernard. So I will certainly go over to Ms. Noelize to help us with that. But Noelize, as I go to you, I get a sense that in some of what Bernard has said, and in some of what I've been hearing, that we should probably not throw out the baby with the bathwater. And in a sense that maybe there's not everything in everything that is bad, and what we should extract what is good, what is okay, and add to it what we need. Take away from it what we think is bad and add what we think is good. So, for example, you're a very pragmatic person. And I know you wouldn't want to say, take your $600,000 and just throw it away somewhere and say, hey, I don't want that again. If you paid $600,000 for something, I think it might be worth the while extracting what is. You see, Bernard spoke about pragmatism, right? Let's take what is good out of it. Let's take out what is bad. Let's pull them out and let's put in some of what Dr. Andre said, some of what Bernard is talking about, some of you yourself are going to come up with an Alvin and Bosso. And let's put that in there and make it something that we can live with. Let me just go over to you now, Noelize, to give us your wisdom on those things.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Mr. Gregoire, and good night to you. Good night to your listeners. And thank you as well for the best wishes and congrats that you gave earlier. But I want to make it clear that I am not sitting here with the president of the Bar Association hat on my head. That is not the role that I am in tonight. I'm here as a member of the Dominica Freedom Party, and yes, as a professional attorney at law, for sure, but not with the hat of the president of the Bar Association. And hopefully sometime in the future, I'm sure that the Bar Association will itself roll out its own activities or its own sessions dealing with the electoral reform and the proposed bills and so on, and we would look forward to that. Yes. But as a member of the Freedom Party, I have to agree with Bernard in the sense that, and as you said, Mr. G, that we should not be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Certainly, and we've done maybe not as deep a dive as we would like to into it, because it's quite a bit of legislation. I mean, we're looking at about 6 to 7 pieces of legislation here, including the rules, the regulations, and so on, that we have to look at and do a deep dive into. We've done quite a bit of that, and we still have more to go. At this stage, I can say for sure that, when we look at what Dominicans have been asking for up to this point, when we look at that, well, let's focus on that for a moment. What have we been asking for? We've been asking for a cleansing of the list, number one. That is first and foremost, a cleansing of the list, number one. That is the main thing. I would say 60, 70, 80% of Dominicans, that's what we want, a cleansing of the list. Number two, we want to look at the issue of persons coming into Dominica to vote. What criteria is there to decide whether you are resident in Dominica or not? I see Dr. Irvin Andre proposes this term of being ordinarily resident, but that again needs to be defined. What is ordinarily resident? What does that mean? What are the criteria for that? And I think, reading the report, I see that Sir Dennis himself struggled with that. We have to define that. What does that mean? Whether it is ordinarily resident, absent for 5 years, what does that mean? And this is what this legislation definitely needs to address for it to be acceptable. What does that mean? You know, so the issue of persons who do not live in Dominica being able to vote. What does this legislation say about that? So that's issue number two. And I think issue number three, sorry, in terms of what people have really been asking for all of these years past, and I mean, for the past many, many years since 2000, I think I would say the last 3 elections ago, what people have been asking for is dealing with this issue of the payment of passages for persons to come in to vote. Does the legislation address that? That has been the cry of Dominicans. Is this right or is this wrong? That is the issue. Is it correct to pay for the passages of persons to come into the country to vote? What does the legislation say about that? If it addresses that, then great. If it does not, we have some work to do. You know, so if we look for first at the issue of the cleansing of the voters list, I see that the process being recommended by Sir Dennis is a reconfirmation of voters. So you have your voters list, and on the day that this act is passed, the old voters list will become the new voters list, and there is a period within which people have to confirm themselves on that list. So firstly, you're starting off with the old list. Do we want that? Do we want to start off with the old list and have that period of reconfirmation, or do we want a re-registration of voters altogether? And I think that the position against the re-registration of voters has always been the cost of doing so, etc., etc. But let us look at that process of reconfirmation and see if it will bring us at the end of the day to a cleansed list, meaning that the dead people are off of the list. The persons who do not qualify to vote, meaning persons who are either not ordinarily resident or absent from Dominica for the 5-year period and not here for 90 days during that 5 years, will they be off the list at the end of the day? And those are the important questions that we have to answer. When I looked at the bill, I would have to say, yes, I think that the reconfirmation period provides for deceased persons being removed from the list, because certainly a deceased person cannot come and reconfirm themselves on the list unless someone tries to do it in their place, unless someone tries to impersonate a dead person and tries to reconfirm under that name. But I think the legislation caters for that, in that it requires a facial biometric to be taken. It requires some proof that you are the person that you say you are. It does require proof of that. But my main issue is the ability of persons who do not qualify, meaning that they have been absent from the state for a period of 5 years, whether you say it's continuously or whether you say that they haven't been here for the 90 days. I think that the way that the proposed legislation is right now, that there is still the possibility of these persons finding themselves back on the list. And that is an issue. That is a problem. When we look at the regulations required for the reconfirmation process, it provides a form. So there's a form that you fill up, and on that form, there is a space that says residence status. So I can say I'm a resident. I just put in there I'm a resident, and that's it. What are the documents that are going to be required to prove that you are resident or not resident? The bill is silent on that. That is an issue. What are the documents that are going to be required? To my mind, the regulation should speak to those specific documents that are required. Right now, it has a general thing saying that any documents that the chief registering officer may request of you. I mean, to me, that's too vague. That is too vague, and it needs to really say What are the documents? Are you going to, you need to provide your passport. Essentially, that needs to be provided at the end of the day. If it is clear from the application form that you do not live in Dominica or your address is outside of Dominica, you must have to provide your passport to show whether you meet the requirements of having not been absent from Dominica for 5 years. You know, you must have to provide that. And right now, the regulation is silent as to that. And the regulation goes on to say, or it gives criteria as to how the chief elections officer can disallow you. But it does not say in the positive on what criteria will he allow you to be confirmed. I'm not sure as to why it is that they chose to put it in the negative as to the criteria that where you will be disallowed as opposed to the criteria where you will be allowed. I would have to ask further questions and dig into that a little bit more, but it seems peculiar to me. So that, because remember, if you look at the regulations, you will see that it is really in the discretion of the chief elections officer whether he will affirm you or not. So to leave it as a negative criteria to say, well, these are the circumstances where he would disallow you. If he's satisfied that you have been out of the jurisdiction for 5 years, he will disallow you. He may disallow you, but there's no documentary proof that you have been. To me, that whole section just requires a further revision, a further chatting, a further discussion about it to really make it plain and clear so that we do not have persons who are back on the list who everyone knows has been out of Dominica for the prescribed period. You know, I don't know if you want me to move on to the second issue, or if I want to leave. I know that Bosso is eager to say a few things, so probably I can come back in later on the second issue of the treating of the payment of passages to come into the country, which legislation is just silent about that. It's absent, you know, but I will come back to that a little later.
Well, who am I to tell a distinguished lawyer what to do? You know, I know that Bosso is waiting. I know that Alvin has a lot to say as well, but if you think that you'd like to give us a little bit more on that while it's still fresh in your mind, I can see that you want to do it.
But it is really just to say that, you know, that to me, this is something that so many Dominicans have been speaking up about, that we do not like the idea of a political party paying the passages of persons to come into the country to vote. In my view, in my own personal and respective view, this to me is treating. This is treating, this is bribery, in my view. You know, it is the amount that you pay. It is not a matter of giving somebody, providing transportation from their home in Maho to the polling station up by the school. That is a completely different thing, as you know, compared to paying a passage into the country. You know, this is a large amount of money being spent to bring someone in. Clearly, it is in return for their putting that X next to your name on the ballot.
Well, you know, the thing is, it's not just someone, right? We cannot recall the site at Melbourne Airport. They had a whole series of aircrafts there, chartered aircrafts there. That's not just someone, that's millions of dollars worth of people's passages and so on. But here is what Dr. Andre, the way he put it, Noelize, he said, the definition of bribery in the applicable election legislation should specifically include the paying for the air or sea travel for persons for the express or implied purpose of having that person or persons vote for a candidate or political party during an election. So I think he's agreeing with you, and I think you're both agreeing that there needs
yes, we're agreed on that.
Very clear. The thing will be very clear as to what the definition of bribery, and you need to, because this has been the vexing thing there for years. You need to be very clear about it and eliminate that possibility. So the chief elections officer and whoever else, they have the avoidance of doubt, as my attorney general would say, in the avoidance of doubt. Let's put that in there so that it's clear in everybody's mind what it is.
Agreed. And to the extent that the proposed legislation does not speak to that directly, to me, that needs to be addressed before this is accepted.
But it's a worrying thing that is not in there, because that has been the major problem that has been vexing a lot of Dominicans for many, many years. So you wonder why that is not clearly stated in there. But
Indeed.
let's maybe we can give you a little ease up here now, Noelize, and I'm sure you'll come back with a lot more. I'm not so sure. Boston, you look like you really want to say something. I mean, after the distinguished attorney, I'll let you go ahead now, and then we'll come to Alvin last. Not because he's the youngest among us, maybe it's because he's the best looking. So we'll go to Alvin last. So, Bosso, let's go with you now.
Well, thank you, Mr. G, and of course, my colleagues from the Dominican Freedom Party, Lambi, Sherwin, Q95 on the whole, and our listeners at home and abroad. It is nice to be here with you, Mr. G, on Global View. I mean, you have been doing a fantastic job. And the whole idea is to provide information to people that they can make informed decision. Now, the Dominican Freedom Party is a party, a political party that was formed in 1968. We will be 55 years old in October of this year. So we have been on the scene for a long time, and we have contested elections in 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, until this goes on. And what happened during those days, you had the Freedom Party, the Labour Party, and then in 1980, you had the Alliance Party, the Democratic Labour Party, the Labour Party and the Freedom Party. And we all participated in elections. And at the end of the election, particularly in 1980, the Freedom Party was declared the winner. The others were not happy because obviously you are in it to win, but they felt that the process was okay and people participated fairly. There was no fright about people casting their votes, because even now you hear people say that they are afraid to vote because they got the impression that the other side, meaning the government side, will know who they vote for, and they're fearing victimization. So if that is a popular saying, then there is something wrong in our electoral process. Now, I'm not saying the process in the 70s and 80s were perfect, and the 90s, but those who administer the process did their work. The chief elections officers, like we had Clem John, we had Rita Serafin, we had Marina Williams, and as chief elections officers, and of course, the Electoral Commission that ensured that no one interfere with what they were doing, and to ensure at the end of the day, the party, the candidates who won will return fair and square, and so forth. So you had, after election, a period of, if you like, uniting the country and people moving on to focus on the economics, the employment, the healthcare, and so forth. From since 2005, we have seen that this present government has exploited the loopholes in the process, and they are creating a situation where at the end of the election that, yes, they are declared the winners, but you have a level of bitterness, unsettlement in the society. And that is not good for our economics, our development as a country, and our peace, and so forth. The Freedom Party was established for freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. And we are a reasonable people in Dominica, and we want things to happen that would benefit the country. And the Freedom Party, the reason why we got involved with so many other groups, civil society, other political parties, is to show that electoral reform is not a partisan issue. It is a national issue. And Freedomites, Laborites, Europeites, and otherites can agree and disagree on matters to do with reform. We all know what we have been asking for all these years: cleansing the lease, voter ID cards, and so forth. These are the things we've been asking for: access to the media. And what we have seen lately is our election has been, if you like, hijacked by large sums of money, so that become a concern for us. Now, the same thing existed in the other Caribbean countries, but they have since done reform and put things in place. I know, for example, in St. Kitts, the OAS assisted them to pay for the reform. And we have been on reform since 2005. We have been talking reform. We're in 2023, and we are still there. So we have to ask ourselves why we're not getting a resolution on this issue and settle this issue once and for all, and to move on. And to move on. Now, reform is a continuous thing because in the early days, women could not vote. And it's the same reform that gave women the right to vote. You know, you had a situation where you had to have property to run for election, land and money in the bank. So those of us who were not fortunate to have land and money were not considered in the whole process of contesting for election. Reform got this to change. You had to be 21 years of age to vote, and it was felt that the young people were kept back too late before they participate in the political process. It was moved from 21 to 18. So young people can vote from 18. So it's a continuous thing to reform the process and to make it fairer, and transparent, and so forth. So we should be very proud from Freedom Party, from Global View, from every other organization to talk about reform without fear or favor, because we're talking of improving, the electoral process in our country, because elections have consequences. Elections are very serious matters. It determines your future, your social situation, your employment. It determines that. If you elect a government that corrupt the process and get in there, it means your whole future can be damaged and so forth. If you elect a government that is not working in your interests, then you can move them come the next election. But if the system is not fair, transparent, then it means the government has a way, the incumbent, to exploit the situation, remain there. So 15, 20 or more years, you're there under the same old system, in the same old position, and so forth. And what become your survival is handout. And he doesn't want that, and so forth. So elections have consequences. Now, we have been talking about voter ID cards for all of these years. And our present legislation makes provision for voter ID card. We just have to pass the regulation so that the commission can have the teeth to implement it. Then in the first preliminary report that Mr. Barron, Des Byron, presented, he mentioned voter ID card because he recognized that the Electoral Commission does not have the authority by law to administer national ID card. And he said so in the preliminary report. And he fought in the early report, and others fell too. And I saw on Dr. Andre's list here, he talked of voter ID card, and of course, including the biometrics and biometric data and fingerprinting. We can do that. But so Dennis Byron, in his final report, he mentioned national ID card, but when you look at it, there is nothing in there making provision for national ID card. When you read it, it looked like he's talking about a voter ID card, but I don't know if it's for semantics or for whatever reason or to please somebody. He made mention of national ID card and so forth. But we're saying this language must be clear because the Electoral Commission, Electoral Office, will issue a voter ID card to a registered voter 18, who's 18 and above. The national ID card is from 10 years, 10 and above, and so forth. A 10-year-old is not a voter. and so forth. So there's a confusion there. And I think, as I mentioned, the whole question of the name, if it's there for pleasing someone or for semantics, should be clearly defined as a voter ID card. And if in the future the authority want to look at national ID card, then they can do so, because you'd have to change the law and make provision in the law for the commission to administer national ID cards and so forth. So as I said, election have consequences, and you're not just voting because it's a show, a carnival, and you follow the crowd. You're voting to select people, because all of us can't be in parliament. So this is why we define the 21 constituencies, and people choose who they want to represent them for the 5 years to go into parliament and so forth. And a number of the things that Dr. Andre recommended, yes, these are very important things that we ourselves support. There's some things here are immediate, and there's some things there that will, if you like, things to have on the agenda, because as I said, reform is a continuous thing. And as we go along, things like term limit and fixed dates will come into play, because these are necessary. But if we have to take it on now, it may further delay the whole process of what we want to achieve. So I'll stop there, Mr. Chief.
Yes, and thank you for that, Bosso. I mean, clearly, as Bernard said earlier, I mean, yes, there has to be an incremental approach to some extent. There are things that are more pressing now. Obviously, some of the recommendations that Dr. Andre made, in fact, he recognized and he noted and acknowledged that they would require constitutional amendments. I mean, for you to go to 2-term limits and so on, and a fixed date for election, you'd have to amend the constitution. But I think if people have the political will to do that, these things can be amended if they want to. But you see, but also you asked a question, and I'm hoping Alvin will answer it for you, but I'll try to answer it a little bit. I'm not a lawyer. But, you know, you asked, well, why is the reform not happening? Let me just remind you, boss, of that famous letter, that email. Dwayne said, look, these fellows doing madness in the Electoral Commission. They want to go and clean voters list and do all kind of things, re-register people. That will affect your winning legacy, right? That is the reason why this reform is not taking place. You know, Bosso said, Alvin, and that's something I've heard you say before, elections have consequences. Yes, elections have many consequences. Dominicans are reaping the consequences of not having looked closely at the democracy. You see what is happening now? People are afraid to talk. People vex with their neighbor, they vex with their cousin, they vex with their husband and their wife because one of them is red, one of them is blue. I mean, since when has Dominica got like that? It's time for us to fix that back, bring people back together. But then again, Alvin, as I come to you, we cannot forget some of the vexing things that both Bernard and Noelize spoke about. The whole question of the bribery. You know what is causing all that is the big dark money that's coming from all over the place that's causing people to spend millions of dollars with CO and all kind of things and chartering planes and bringing people to vote. You know, it's all of that big money. So campaign finance reform has to take care of that, to limit that kind of largesse from big dark money. I mean, you don't want people giving millions of dollars to political power. When you get in government, they control what you do, and then, you know, your people can't get jobs. They decide who working, who not working, that kind of thing. I don't think this is not a desirable thing for us. And one other thing, Alvin, as we go to you, when we speak about a voter ID card, I mean, it's not just a matter of having a voter ID card. Obviously, it's what's on that card, as Noelize would tell us. You know, a card has to have, of course, the biometric data. I like the fingerprint ID and the facial recognition, both of them. Make the thing more secure, more sound. You can determine really that is the real person, right? But then again, the thing should say where you reside, and which constituency, not just in non-legal, because you vote in constituencies at polling stations. It must say which constituency you reside. Now, in terms of that definition there, Noel, is about your normal place of abode, your place of ordinary residence. Seems to me you can't be living, if you're living in New York, right? and you have an address there, you're going to work every day, you're going back home every day. You live there. If you come and visit Dominica for 2 weeks, you don't live in Dominica. You visit in Dominica, you go back to your home in New York where you live. If I live in Roseau and I go and spend a weekend in Granby, my residence is still Roseau. I mean, I go and spend a weekend in Granby. So it seems to me the voter ID card has to be very specific about all of those things. So in the avoidance of all doubt, I'm playing lawyer now. Alvin, let me go over to you because I know that you have a lot more that you want to contribute. And then we'll go back to Bernard, and then of course we will let Lambi take some calls because you know, Alvin, we like to interact with the folks out there. I'm sure they have a lot to say. It's not often that they hear from the Freedom Party, and it's not often that they hear the voice of a illustrious Noelize Knight Didier. And I know that people are hearing her voice on a program like this with the Freedom Party for the first time. And then I think a lot of people now will want to hear more from her. So we will be circling back to Bernard and to Noelize and so on later. Alvin, let me go over to you now.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. G. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting us to this program this evening. Let me say a pleasant good evening to the rest of my colleagues here on the program, and in particular to my good friend Lambi in studio. Lambi, good old friend. We go way, way, way back. And to Sheridan in the control, and to the many listeners who that tuned in on various social media platforms and Q95. Thank you. Let me just begin by pretty much endorsing what has been said so far by my colleagues, but in particular to say, Mr. G, that as far as it relates to electoral reform, this should be clearly a non-partisan issue. This ought not to be moved forward as a political issue, which seems to be the case. The manner in which the Prime Minister is handling it, the fact that he has appointed this Daru minister to spearhead the discussion, clearly that spells it stinks. So let me say from the onset that ought not be the case. There is a reason why the Constitution provided for an electoral commission. But let me also say too that in terms of electoral reform, this by and large is a people's business. Election is about the people. And you're so right. I've said so in so many forums that election has consequences. And we have seen what those consequences are. If the result is skewed and you end up not having the right people being elected, then obviously the end product is not going to be good. I think to some extent, the CCJ made reference of that in their report that they issued in July of 2022. And they spoke of the likely consequences that can come out of a bad election, an illegal election, an illegitimate election. So it's not just a question of we saying that, but it's what is felt across the board. The question still remains is, why is it after 15 years or more, we can't get this right? The people of Dominica can't seem to say, well, hey, this is what we want. Because as I said, it's a people's thing. It's not, it's not a Freedom Party thing, a Labour, a UWP, it's the people. Section 33 of the Constitution, Section 33, 1, 2, A and B speaks specifically as to why every citizen at the age of 18 is required pretty much to vote, or give them that privilege or that authority to elect their representative. So it's a people's thing. And it's really unfortunate that we, even at this 11th day of July, 2023, we're still discussing that. I happen to have came across, and you may have seen it too, something going through social media. And it was showing the number of times CARICOM countries have changed government since 2000. I'm sure you saw that. And there were 15 countries on that list, 15, all members of CARICOM as well. And everyone, you had some who have had change of government as many as 6 times. St. Lucia 5 times, Jamaica, a whole list, 15 countries. Dominica had a 0 by its name. 0 since 2000 have changed government. So clearly that speaks to the question of why we should have some reform in Dominica. Ironically, the heads of the CARICOM just met in Trinidad, observing their 50th anniversary as an institution. And it would and the Prime Minister of Dominica has taken over the chairmanship of that body. And it would have been really interesting to note whether any discussion took place as it relates to governance, elections, and those areas of concern at their deliberation as they observe 50 years as an organization. It would be very interesting. I know Noelize has pointed out and highlighted several areas. I myself had looked at several areas in the Act, and she's absolutely correct. The draft legislations are very vague on the areas that she have mentioned, very vague. The whole question of campaign financing and bribery and treating is a major, major issue. And even the whole question of the electors list or the electors register. As a matter of fact, that is one of the major issues that was raised in the CCJ's report. The fact that they tell you an electors list determines whether an election is legitimate or illegitimate, whether it's lawful or unlawful. That's what that list determines. So certainly that's an area of major, major concern. Back on the question of campaign financing, there is a document that was prepared. Well, several documents referred to it, but it was a document prepared by Julian Johnson and other documents. And that document referenced in 2019, the Dominica Labour Party spent $26.64 million on the elections. That's a total of somewhere like 72.38 million EC dollars. That's a lot of money. In the absence of campaign financing, and when we speak about the whole question of treating and bribing, $72 million, that is literally $1 million per citizen. If we say the citizen of Dominica is 72,000 persons, that's $1 million per head to spend on an election in a country like Dominica. So clearly, that's a major issue that has to be addressed. And as I think Noelize has rightly pointed out, it's not addressed at all anyway in the legislation. There was also another document prepared by a distinct professor at UWI called Cynthia Barrow-Giles. And she prepared a document back, I think it was in somewhere around 2000 thereabout, on the question of campaign financing. And the subtitle of a document was Political Financing in the Caribbean, Time to Dismantle the Fence. And interestingly though, among the islands in the region that at some level, not totally, but some level of finance was Barbados, Guyana, and Jamaica. So in terms of disclosure, in Guyana, you have to disclose. In terms by the candidate has to disclose. Contribution limits has to be disclosed. Spending limit has to be disclosed. Outside of that, most of the other islands do not have. And we know that's a major issue. So clearly that's an issue that has to be addressed in moving forward. The last thing I might want to say is that all the discussions that are taking place is not new, meaning that there are several organizations way back then, both regional and local, that have in some shape or form attempted to address this issue. We know of the multi-sectorial group they had in Dominica that made up of political parties, trade unions, business groups, civic, religious, and they have presented quite eloquently at least the major 4 or 5 areas that they believe require some level of reform. So this is not nothing new. And having said that, we would like to compliment them and encourage them and say hats off. In terms of Dr. Andre's submission, as I think Bosso have rightly said, there are a number of areas there that we fully subscribe to. Some of these areas, as Bernard has said, are areas that could look at later on, like in particularly the areas that addresses constitutional reform, which is a much bigger issue than presenting a legislation to Parliament. But I would just end by saying, in a nutshell, it is my hope that the people of Dominica, not saying political parties now, political parties have a role to play, don't get me wrong, but the people of Dominica, through the various organs and organizations, I know there is an ERC establishment in place having discussion. The people need to say, look, we've had enough, and it's time that we get the reform that we want. And I'm almost certain Dominicans are still very bright people, very astute. I'm not sure why it is we have not demanded it, but I believe, Mr. G, if you tell me at this time around, I think Dominicans are very, very enthused. And I think this time around, they are going to demand what I think rightfully they need to.
Yes, and I certainly hope so, Alvin. But as Bernard said, and you mentioned there's several groups and organizations involved. You have civic organizations, you have political parties, you have the church groups, you have the bar association, you have the private sector organizations, NGOs, and so on. And as Bernard says, sometimes there's not always a meeting of the minds. You have a diverse number of ideas. That's fine. But at some point in time, we have to eliminate the things that we agree on, and just, let's agree on certain things and let's try to work out the others. Because at some point, there has to be a meeting of the minds. If every organization is going to go on their own merry way and looking at different things, and, it's not going to work. There has to be a coming together and discuss. And then, like-minded people, right-thinking people have to agree. Let's focus on some things that are achievable. Let's get that done, and let's move on to the other things, right? So I'm just going to ask Lambi. Lambi, we have to take the people's calls, and I really would like you to give out the numbers, and so that people can call us at their leisure. You just make us a sign, and then we'll break away and allow you to take the calls. But then once you're done giving them the numbers, if we don't have calls, I'll go back to Bernard. After them, we're going to throw it out, because we don't need to be too rigid in the conversation going forward. I believe we would like to hear a lot more from Noelize on the actual, some of that legislation, some of the provisions of the draft laws. So Lambi, let's go over to you and give out the numbers, and then you'll let us know what's happening in the calls.
This is Q95. You are viewing and or listening to Global View and Q. The numbers to contact us are as follow: 449-3095, 449-3096, 449-3097, 616-4257. These are all local numbers. The overseas number or international number, 305-432-9624. Let me repeat those numbers again: 449-3095, 449-3096, 449-3097, 616-4257, local numbers, and the international number, 305-432-9624. And as a caution, when making your calls, be as brief as possible, because we'd like our guests to have some time to make their contributions also. Over to you, Mr. G.
Yes, and I was saying that, Bernard, we need to have a meeting of the minds, right? And, Alvin, as Alvin said it right, it is not just political parties, but the political parties have a high stake, because it is in fact political parties that are going to form the government. It is not just every organization, so political parties have a meaningful role to play, but no one political party should be allowed to dominate the whole process, because every political party has its own self-interest in winning an election. So, and if, as we know, one of the political parties say they want to stay there for the next 50 years, so, how can we allow that political party to dominate the process of electoral reform? Because obviously, why would they want to change anything? If you've been in there for 23 years, Bernard, why would you want to change anything? Things are working out for you. So it's obvious that that political party cannot be allowed to take the lead in doing this. It has to be something that is sort of completely. They can have their own meetings. Every political party can have their consultations and so on, and have their own ideas. But certainly to make your idea the national idea cannot be. Now, one of the things Bernard and Noelize helped me out here, Loyalists, you said, this thing has so many different sections. It's a lot of pages of stuff to read. Bernard, you tell me how many people are going to be in an audience somewhere. If you have 200 people in an audience in a meeting somewhere in Vegas or in Lapley or in Granby, anywhere, if you have 200-300 people, how many of those people you think would have read those documents? Probably none of them. So you might find the AG or somebody going to tell him, okay, that is what, that is that, and everybody clap. But the point is that we need to explain to people what is there. And we need to take away the highfalutin language and just let people know these are the things that we need to remove the bribery, to remove the treating, to make sure you know who get the dead people off the list. It has to be put in simple language, Bernard. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely correct, Mr. G. And it is our responsibilities as social leaders, as leaders of political parties, but social leaders generally, to do that hard work. And that is one of the things that I'm advocating, have been advocating through the various groups, through the various discussions that we're having, the various collaborations between political parties and others. And you are correct. Political parties must be, the reality is the political parties must be deeply engaged and hopefully driving the process with collaboration, consultation, and the input and the leadership as well of other entities. But political parties, at the end of the day, that's the process through which governments are enacted. And so we must be deeply engaged. And in that regard, then, we have a real responsibility to truly do the hard work. It's going to take hard work to displace this government. And we must begin to demonstrate to Dominicans that we are prepared to do the hard work, to read the 80 pages of the legislation, to digest that, to debate that, to understand that as thoroughly as possible. We simply have to do the hard work. It is our responsibility to do that. And then to reproduce, as you said, in simple, understandable language, the key issues that are germane to ensuring that the legislation is acceptable. And we've been doing that. We've been digging through this and digesting it. And our hope is really to really be able to explain that very cleanly here very shortly. And when you look at this legislation and all these pages and pages and pages of documents, really 80% of this is no issue. 80% of this is common sense. 80% of this is the previous legislation. 80% of this is just procedural stuff, red tape, bureaucratic needs, and so forth and so on. You really can boil this down to less than, in my mind, 10 to at most 20% of the clauses in this legislation.
Can you let me indulge me a minute? Let me just
Sure.
let go over to Lambi. He wants to take a call from someone who wants to make an urgent call. Lambi?
Global View, good evening, caller. Please go ahead.
Yes, good evening.
Raise your voice, please.
Yes. I'd like to just address two small issues. I heard Mr. G ask the question, how we got there. And the reason is that one man said, no law, no constitution. And I think that is the genesis of why we are where we are. All of the things in the law that pertain to the law and the Constitution, he chooses what he wants to obey, what he doesn't want, it doesn't work. So we can see what happens at the courts, we can see opposition people, what happens to them in the courts and so forth. So no law, no constitution is the reason. And the second issue I'd like you to address is the abuse of incumbency. Today I listened to the discussion on Q, and the idea was brought up that during fiscal year 2019, the year of the election, $36 million was the amount of overdraft that Parliament authorized. But during that particular fiscal year, the fiscal year, $152 million were taken in overdraft. And that difference, that's over and above the 36.5. And that amount was made as a long-term loan that we and our children would have to pay for. The point I'm making is, during that period, a 2019 election, things happen with public funds that went into campaign. For example, like giving out cash to people or using the rapid response and other things. Excessive spending during an election year. I'd like you to address that, please. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much for that question. One of the things that I think the framers of our Constitution probably very mistakenly believed is that every person who became a leader of a government would be a gentleman. There would be no rogues or vagabonds or any kind of people like that going to lead the country, and that they would abide by the country. Who knew anybody would say no law on the Constitution? I mean, who knew anybody would say that? I mean, the framers didn't anticipate that, obviously. And so there's so many other things. I mean, the caller talked about all this largesse in spending money. Even if you talk about a campaign period, an election campaign period, even if it's 90 days. I mean, what we see in Canada and so on is just a few days. It's just, within 90 days, certainly. And all this largesse of this money being spent, a little country like Dominica with 70,000 people, why you need to spend all these millions and millions of dollars on a campaign? And then to have all this CEO bringing in big bands and coming in and doing all this treating and so on months before. And so on, all of that is absolutely, it never happened that way before. I mean, we've seen the Labour Party before, we've seen we've seen freedom. We never saw this kind of thing before. So, I mean, it's something new that is happening in our electoral process. And so, I mean, Noelize, help us out if you can with this, because it seems to me that we really need to do something because we saw what happened to our IPO when the IPO, which is a constitutional body, tried to take some action. And it was dissolved. And it was reduced to 3 people. And these 3 people then had to say, listen, we're not interested in pursuing that matter anymore. And up to now, we haven't heard anything from the IPO again, except the latest thing we've heard is one of your colleagues brought up a challenge. And we hope to see how that is going to be resolved in the court. But certainly, it seems to me, is this what these people in the Electoral Commission are fearful of? Why somebody can just write an email and say, look, these fellas are doing madness down there, you have to make them stop. Is that the kind of concerns that we have?
Well, on the electoral, on the campaign financing point, Mr. G, again, I go back again to what Bernard said from the very beginning, and you yourself said that we threw out the baby with the bathwater. The proposed bill, we're coming from a situation of zero, where our legislation really doesn't say anything on campaign financing. To this proposed legislation, which is saying, 1, the parties must produce an account of what they have spent. They must show the source of funding. It makes certain sources of funding illegal. We didn't have those things before. This is important. These are important strides. It also provides for a cap. It doesn't say what that cap is right now, but it does provide for a cap on campaign spending. It goes on to say that the commission can increase that cap by order, and there can be some critique that is made of that. I mean, why should the commission be permitted to increase that cap? But we know how quickly it takes for legislation to change in Dominica. It might be that 20 years down the line, we are facing inflation, that cap becomes meaningless, and it takes forever to change the legislation to see what the cap is. So the framers of this proposed bill have put in a way where you can increase or decrease the cap through the commission. And again, as you were saying, we're assuming that the persons within the commission are persons of integrity and so on, but it is our constitution that says who the persons on the Electoral Commission are. It is the Constitution who says who these people are. The Constitution doesn't put a limit to say, well, it can only be a lawyer, or it just says the chairperson chosen by the president, 2 on the advice of the opposition, and 2 persons chosen by the president on the advice of the government, of the prime minister. So it's there in our constitution. We cannot change that. The constitution doesn't provide any other criteria. We cannot change that. If we're looking at constitutional reform, that, brothers and sisters, that takes years, that takes a lot of discussion, planning, etc., etc., etc. At this stage of our electoral reform process, we have to look at the legislation that is before us and ask ourselves, how far have we come, or how far is this proposing? Yes, it might not be at the 10 that we want it, but is it at 7? Is it going from 0 to 7? Is it going from 0 to 8? the previous proposed legislation, there were provisions that permitted you to cleanse the list, you know. There were provisions there which allowed political parties to cleanse the list, to object to certain people, but the process was not sufficient. The process was lacking. So this proposed bill brings it up a bit. Does it bring it up to the level that we want it? Maybe not. That is what we have to ask ourselves and look at it, but we cannot throw it out altogether because it's going from a level of 1 to a level of 7 or a level of 8. You know, so we have to look at it, and sometimes, Mr. G, I speak in a non-partisan way, because we have to look at this thing critically, objectively, in a non-partisan way, so that all persons who are listening, whether it be opposition, government, whoever they be, so that all persons are listening can listen to us with reason, without the emotions of the politics. You know, listen to us and listen to the reasoning that we're bringing to the table and saying, okay, this makes sense. I can listen to this, can listen to that, and so on. You indicated to your listeners that it is the first time I'm appearing with the Freedom Party. I don't know if you meant on this program. It is certainly my first time on this program, but I have appeared with the Freedom Party several occasions before as a member, as it is my democratic right to be a member of a political party in Dominica. I have appeared with them and spoken on many different topics, particularly topics that deal with my particular expertise. You know, I tend to want to stay away from the emotive politics, because sometimes you don't get very far with that. You know, you don't get very far with that. Something as important as electoral reform, it has to be done in a non-partisan way. It has to be done where all parties can sit at the table and discuss this and see how we can move to somewhere that the whole country can say, yes, we have accomplished this and this is where we want to be, you know?
Yes, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. Anybody can just jump in now, you know, because I mean, I'm sure the way this discussion is going now, we can see there are things that we need to address.
Yes, Mr. G. I just want to give an example. There was an election in the UK many years ago, and David Cameron was Prime Minister, and they had a housing project going on, and people were demanding that during the campaign, they distribute the houses. And Cameron said, no. He suspend anything to do with distributing houses during the campaign, and it's left for after the election. If the Conservative return to government, they'll distribute. If the Labour Party becomes a government, they will. And they stop it. But you see here, the party, I remember, you know, in 1995, when, before the election, the campaign that was trying to build up, and Sir Brian Arlene was becoming the leader of the party, take over from Miss Charles. And when we went to a particular constituency, I won't name the constituency now, the person who was named as the candidate for the party told us there is a particular road in that constituency. If we can get it done, then that candidate would really be in a good position or better position to win that seat. And when we went to Miss Charles about that, she said, no, she's not doing anything for election. If it's there to be done, she'll do it, but not for election purposes. And it was not done until after the election and so forth. So there are examples that we can talk about. And the caller said, in terms of where we're at and the role of the government, but I still blame us too as a people. We sometimes believe that we are spectators in the whole issue, and we sit aside and look like we're watching a game, and we're not involved. And we say, where is the parties? The parties have a role, yes, but the people, the citizens already have a role to play too. And sometimes we give the Prime Minister too much support, in the sense that we feel certain things that we as a people should be doing, we just give it up and allow him to take it over. We need as a people to examine your performance. When you come to us with your record card to report on your stewardship. And if you pleases what we want you to govern us with, then fine, we'll re-elect you. If not, get out, let somebody else come out. And Alvin made the point earlier about elections in the rest of the countries. In St. Kitts, when they were talking about reform, the St. Kitts Labour Party was resisting. The Governor General took it over, and he said every organization must have a seat at the table, and you want to ensure that the opposition is not excluded. Then the election came, a coalition came together and won. They were doing quite well, but they got a little over themselves in terms of power, and they lost the last election. Who came back? The very Denzel Douglas party with a new leader due. So the point is, reform is not for a particular party, it's for the country, for the people. And this is why, if you are the government today and reform is transparent, free and fair election, and you lose election, and the people are not satisfied with who they put there, they'll vote you back. It's a simple process. But you can't hijack and say you want to be there for 50 years, and the rest of us just feel, well, we are living on your estate, and that's it. And we talk sometime, we react sometime, and we just play it cool. No, we have to push for what we want and what is right. And Noelize made the point about removing the emotion from the politics. That is true. We have to focus on the issues that confront the country and the people. And we should never be afraid as a people to discuss matters that are as important as electoral reform on behalf of the country. We should never be afraid. We should be all ready and willing. And Mr. G made the point, if 300 people go to a meeting, say in Vickers, in Ma, whoever, they just hear the attention and they clap and that's it. You know, people have to read the report, and others of us have to go to them and explain to them the report. So it's a task for the country, not only for the government. And I support the point Alvin made about having Dr. Daru, who was a minister a couple months ago, an elected member of parliament for the Labour Party, and a member of the Labour Party spearheading the discussion on reform, the consultation on reform for the country. That should not be. To me, that is just making us look like an old mass kind of thing, an old kind of behavior.
You know,
Well, if I can pivot back to the summary, I was going to give a quick brief summary because you asked the question, Mr. G, on, you know, what is when we look at this legislation, what is the grade assigned, or where do we stand with this thing? And I was making the point that if you look at this legislation carefully, almost 80% of it is fine. In terms of either it is procedural, we would not have an issue with that, or it does not diminish or enshrine any sort of unfair advantage to the government, or it doesn't advance the policy of entrenched interests. So if you look at the legislation, about 80% of it is fine. There's probably 20%, I would say less, that is really contentious. And if we can work across parties, across organizations, to focus on those 20%, to do the hard work, to close the gaps, or to improve the gaps, and to negotiate with all political parties, including the Labour Party, to fix those issues, or at least ameliorate the worst elements of them, I think the Dominican Freedom Party believes we can get a bill out of this process, that we are not far away from being able to get a bill that does improve the democratic process in Dominica. And as Noelize pointed out, the inclusion of some element of campaign finance boundaries, and there are some proposed limits in there, not solidified, that I think is a step forward. The only problem I have with that is the consequences of violating those rules are, in my mind, trivial. $10,000 fine, which would be nothing for an organization who raises millions of dollars. So I think what we need to do is focus on accepting those boundaries, solidifying them, and adding real teeth to the consequences of not complying to those regulations. Those sort of things. I think if we focus on that, if we focus on the issue of fairness, and if we focus on the issue of using technology to validate the ideas, the issues, we can get a bill that works. Dominica really is a trivial database of 60,000 people or less in terms of voting. You could have all these things talking together. In fact, the bill specifies that the death records should be automatically transmitted to the Electoral Commission's office or the Chief Elections Officer, so that he can run this against his list and automatically remove people who have died in the previous year when the list is republished in September. In the same vein, it talks about the possibility of the immigration officials providing information related as requested by the commission in relation to people's presence on the island. That too can be automated, so that the electoral office receives a clean list of people who have died, people who are moved overseas and have maintained their residency, but that's validated for immigration records. And if only those two things, If we could only focus on getting those two things done, so that if we decide that 90 days is an appropriate term to be in Dominica, which would be, to be honest, an improvement of the vague notion of continuous, which could be in 1 day. If we could get there to say at least 3 weeks, almost 3 weeks, 18 days if you work it out, you must be present in Dominica each year, which is not a trivial barrier. So there are things that we can work towards to close the gaps on 3 important issues: making sure that there is some hurdle to participation in the country, your involvement, making sure that there is technology that cross-references those things so that that gap can be reduced, and making sure that electoral reform, finance reform has real teeth that can constrain people's behavior. If only those things, I think we have a bill that actually works to advance the state of democracy in Dominica. And that's what we must keep working toward.
Well,
That's the real hard work to be done. And we must, as an opposition, not lose sight of the outcome. The outcome is good democratic reform and progress that does not inhibit and advantages us. And having access as well to the national media stations does improve the situation. So I want us to keep that perspective in mind as we move forward, that we may not get perfection, but we're not seeking perfection. We're seeking bending the arc of justice in the direction of a better democracy in Dominica.
all right. So here's what I think, Alvin. Here's what I think. You see, Bernard spoke about a percentage of things that need to be put in there in the drafts. That really means there's a percentage of things that need to be removed from what just Sir Dennis Byron put in there for us, which we don't like, which don't make sense. I mean, like Noelize told us about this bribery and treating thing. I mean, there's so many things that have been vexing us for the last how many years, and it seems to me he could have easily just fixed that up and remove any doubt. I mean, put a definition in there so that there's absolutely no doubt about the bribery and treating, about the residency thing and so on. Now, it seems to me that one of the programs that I had, I asked the question when Dr. Andrew was with us, and I asked my audience, who do you really trust more? Is it Sir Dennis Byron's recommendations, or is it Justice Dr. Andrew's recommendations? I know I got nobody to say they trusted Dr. Sir Dennis Byron's own. Everybody says Justice Dr. Andre. I mean, Andre put a few simple things. You can see already there are certain things he put there that are the short term we can do that we agree with. The long-term thing, like to amend the constitution, we know that has to be done later. We know that. But he's making us know that this is something that we need to look at, right, for later. The fact of the matter is, Alvin, when Bernard speaks about those percent, these are some of the things that need to be included. And Noelize has mentioned some of the definitions that need to be more clearly defined and so on. One of the things that you want to do too, and Dr. Andre mentioned that, Alvin, he mentioned that, you see this thing about nolly processing things. So when somebody, whether they're on the electoral commission or the wherever and they do something, and then there's a case, and then they just nolly process it. Even when the CCJ say, listen, you fellas go back and get this thing done, and somebody come and say, listen, we're not doing it. This is something that have to be looked at in the law to ensure that you can go forward. Now, let me tell you why I say that, Alvin. As I said, the framers of our constitution envisage that we're going to have a lot of gentle people like maybe Eugenia Charles and Edison James and these fellas there in office. But you see, there's a gentleman called Matthew Walter. You know him? Guess what he said to us on his Facebook? He said, listen, there's something going on in the GLP that Rosie and Pierre and all those fellas which are in your group. Those fellas not having any kind of elections. He said he don't know if there's a duly constituted executive committee. That's what the man is saying. He's an insider, you know. He's an insider. He was an elected official. He was a minister. He was an ambassador up to recently, I think, to Cuba. And he's saying there's something going on in there. I mean, I don't know if there's a duly elected executive. So what is he saying? You know, somebody mentioned hijack. Who said that? Was it Boss or was it Bernard? Somebody looking to hijack the country for how many years? 50 years. Somebody hijacked Labour Party, it seems, because if there is no elections and then the same people are just there, no elections, you're just like a recurring decimal. Leader becomes leader, and then leader just hand-picking people. I think this chap said in his social media thing there that, constituents is supposed to pick their candidates, but somebody seems to be just picking candidates for constituency. Look, the candidates. Alvin, your thoughts on, so you're a guy who has been in this thing for a long time. You work in the administration. Your thoughts on some of this?
Well, Mr. J, without necessarily wanting to, to look at it in terms of percentage or otherwise, like you've rightly said, there's some basic requirements that we know that we want as it relates to electoral reform. I may add that it's not rocket science, okay? I referred earlier to the CCJ's report. And one of the main areas in that report deals with the electors list, that registry. I always describe it this way when I'm trying to explain in layman terms. You are a member of the Roseau Credit Union. The Roseau Credit Union has its AGM. The only way that you can vote at the AGM to elect the board, you have to be a member and a bona fide member. So if your name is not correct on the list and you're not a bona fide member and you partake in the election of the officers to the board and the various committees, then it makes that board unlawful. It's simple. So the same thing with our elections. If that list, like in 2019, they claimed that the population was 72 or whatever that was, and the electoral list was 74,000. So the population was more than persons on the list. And incidentally, do you know Dominica is the only island in the region that have that anomaly? Grenada just had an election not too long ago. St. Lucia, Antigua, each one of them, their list, the numbers on the list is far less than their population. In the case, I believe, if it was Antigua or one of them, the list was 20,000 less than the population. Ours was 74, the list, and the population was presumably 70 or 72. So right away, there's a problem, a major problem. So that has to be fixed. And I think Noelize talked to that to some extent. Then we come to residency, which is pretty much linked with the list as well. How do you get on the list? So that's an area that has to be fixed. Then we come to voters' ID card. The last so-called quote-unquote sham election that was held, the OAS in their report, that very last 2022, the OAS made a comment that they went to polling stations and there were persons with similar, not just similar names, similar demographic, similar. So there was a Sheridan Gregoire and another Sheridan Gregoire, and same thing. The OAS said that, and the OAS said that's a huge problem. And they recognize that as a problem. So this is basic. We spoke a while ago of campaign finance. Who pays the piper calls the tune. We know what's happening now with money laundering and all those kind of things and influence of persons in elections. We see what happened right here in the United States of America. So don't you think other persons are not trying to influence elections in the region? Some deep pocket guy, some billionaire out there, some millionaire out there, say, hey, man, I can give you $10 million to do X, Y, and Z. And when you get into office, do this for me. So clearly we have to know where the money is coming from. There's absolutely no way. We know, we're not living on Mars. Tell me, Mr. G, where the Labour Party of Dominica in 2019 could have raised the 20, how much? What did I tell you? $26.64 US million. They must have sold a lot of barbecue and fried chicken to raise that money. A lot of barbecue and fried chicken sold. So clearly we have to have something in the legislation. But in addition to that, I think it's Noelize who mentioned it. There has to be a certain level of enforcement as well. Part of the problem we have in Dominica, just going outside of what we are discussing the reform, is enforcement too, and governance. Because we have quite a few legislations that are on the books. You mentioned the IPO, what to do with contract, even basic things like littering, Lloyd announcement, the number of legislation, but no enforcement. So there has to be a certain level of enforcement. In the act where they speak about a $10,000 fine, what's 10,000 as against a party that's coming up with $26.64 million? That's peanuts, that's fucking change. You know what I'm saying? So these are the areas that has to be tightened up and looked at. The question of free media access. In a democracy, let all ideas contend. These are the people that have come to present themselves to the electorate to say that we want to represent you, to be your representative based on Constitution, Section 33. They should be allowed access to present to you what their plans are. So these are some of what one might say the low-lying fruits that we have to address. And I think Noelize put it quite rightly too, A lot of times what happened in those discussions, there's emotion that goes with it. We become very emotional, and we somehow in the process lose some level of objectivity. And if I don't agree with you on a particular point, it means I'm against you. So I must agree to everything you say. If not, I'm not with you. And I think that too is one of the growing up that has to take place. I was on a program recently with, again, a lady, as we were joking earlier on. Maybe now is the era for the ladies to take charge of this thing and come forward and show maybe some of us, the men, what needs to be done. And she made the point. Crisis and leadership, what determines your character as a leader member? Crisis and leadership.
Well,
And I would say,
let's put it another way, Alvin. And I want to ask Noelize about that because you mentioned
yes,
ladies.
yeah,
You mentioned ladies. Here's the thing, Noelize, I've been listening to this lady called Judy Christian of late, and this lady is going around helping these kids to get into all kind of debates, and these kids are debating and they're winning debates. They went to St. Lucia, I think, and had some debates, and the Dominicans did extremely well. I want to ask you, this is something that we have not really been discussing in our politics of late. I find these campaign periods, what you have is a lot of CO. You're paying millions of dollars to big name artists to bring them down there to play, give people free tickets and give them drinks and so on, and a lot of CO. There's no policy being discussed there. There are no program, no plans on the platform. What you have on these platforms is mostly MAPE. Now, would you think, Noelize, that we should bring back the whole concept of debates in our society, in our system? Because then if political leaders, I think Dr. Andre recommended that as one of his recommendations there, if political leaders by law, like the leaders had to have at least 2 or 3 debates, just like they do in the United States, in Canada, in most of the developed democracies, don't you think it would be a good idea so we could get from these people what are their real plans from the country, rather than just misleading these young people into thinking that this thing is just about zero? Anybody who's 25 years old today knows no other government but the current DLP administration. They don't know of any other government. So if all they see what they think, maybe that's what election campaigns are all about, right? What are your thoughts on bringing back serious debates to see what men and women are really made of on the platform?
Of course, Mr. G. That goes without saying. How can we not have debates? I don't think the young people are fooled. I don't think they think that that's all it's about. I think they just go and enjoy it because it's there to be enjoyed. Why not? But they don't take it seriously because the people in the political parties and the leadership don't take it seriously enough, particularly the ruling party. We don't take it seriously enough in the sense that a simple debate, you are invited to and you refuse those invitations, or you send somebody who is not, or somebody who is low down in the party to attend the debate. To me, it's disrespectful. It is underestimating the intelligence of your populace when you do things like that. I think our young people are yearning for it. Our people on a whole are yearning for that kind of debate, for that kind of fruitful, meaningful discussion and conversation. We're yearning for it. We want it. We have to raise the standards to where the populace wants to be. You know, I read the report from Sir Dennis, and one of the things that struck me was the so few people who participated in the survey. You know, I think it was just about 800 and something people who participated in the survey, and it was, you know, it was disappointing to me that more people would not think it is their duty to participate in that survey and to get out there and have their voice heard. I recall when I turned 18 years old, my father, who, I mean, I think everyone knows, Alvin Knight was a stalwart of the Freedom Party in his day. You know, these days he has nothing to do with politics. But when I was turned 18 years old, my father picked me up from work. I was already working, and he took me to register to vote. And he took me to get my learner's license. That is a significant lesson in my life, that when you become an adult, it becomes, you are reaching a point where you have responsibility, rights, privileges, all coming together. And that act of taking me to get my learner's license and taking me to register to vote was so significant to me. It showed me the importance of those things as an adult, upon becoming an adult. And I know that there are many young people out there who want that feeling, who want to know, you know, who want the leaders in society to recognize that they are worth leading, you know, that they are worth giving an example to, that they're not stupid, that they're not fooled by SIWO, that they want their yearning and they want that information, that learning, that education. They want it, and it's our duty to give it to them, you know. So certainly, I mean, the question of debates is a no-brainer to me. It must be done. It's very easy to put it in the regulations. You wouldn't put it in the substantive act, but you can put it in the regulations.
In the regulations.
At least one or two debates, of course.
Right. No, Bernard, you know, I wanted to go to you with that same issue, because I know you like to speak programs, you like to speak about things like the knowledge industries. You can really boost people's lives and their livelihoods and so on, and improve their quality of life and their living standards. I mean, really and truly, there's so little of that going on now in these political campaigns. You're not hearing enough of discussions of plans and programs and futuristic ideas of how you're going to move an economy forward, how you're going to elevate people's living standards by moving into, for example, the knowledge industries. And many of these industries now, you hear about AI now and all kind of things going on. That is right up your alley. But let's talk about that a little bit, if you can.
Well, you're right, Mr. G, in terms of the substantive discussions that we need to be having as a nation. And not simply as a nation, as a developing nation. To me, a developing nation should be having an ongoing dialogue about what else? Development. How do we develop? How do we define development? What does development look like? Does development look like a few apartment buildings and a few big buildings in town owned by some bigwigs? Does development mean that somehow the GDP is growing because we're importing steel to build those things? We should be having an ongoing dialogue, not just a dialogue, but an ongoing education with the public of what development truly means. Because development should mean increasing freedoms, increasing economic freedoms. You have a better job, you have more money, you have a more interesting jobs that you can go after because the economy is diversifying and complexifying. And you now have interesting work that you're good at that you can get into. So that increases your economic freedom. As your economy develops, you also have social freedom. People become more tolerant of different ideas. They have to respect each other. They have safety increases, cooperation increases if you focus on those things as in your high school curriculum. And so you have social development, a more expansion and the freedom of social development. And of course, political development, political freedom expands when you truly vote people based not on a sense of obligation or a sense of being shackled by a few bribes, but truly based on your conviction of who can take the country forward. Therefore, your political freedom expands when your economy expands. And so that, to me, any leadership from the top down should be an ongoing dialogue in every developing nation. What is development and how are we developing and what programs are we doing to develop? Not only that, I think a wise government would set metrics that are visible to the public, that are made available and discussed periodically, quarterly. here are our objectives, and here we are in terms of how we are accomplishing, and be held accountable to it. And that is the problem. For the past 23 years, nobody has defined development, has having the dialogue of what development is, and metrics that show true development. Instead, we have the Labour Party who constantly fools, in my mind, the public with a few shiny objects and a few smoke and mirror tricks, and sells that as development. But we truly need to have, and the Dominican people and the citizenry should hold the developing countries' leadership to a definition, a clear definition of development, a clear establishment of metrics to those developments, and clearly tied programs that lead into these metrics and discussion of those metrics. That is the sort of discussion we should be having. And that is the sort of discussion we should have every election period, when we should say to the government, let us talk about the report card for the last 5 years. Have a report card been defined, and how have you scored on it? And that is the type of things that we have to do. If we do this, if we hold our government and our people accountable to results, results we shall have. And results is what it takes. Real production, real creation of wealth from knowledge, from ideas, from creativity, from new ideas of how to put things together, how to do useful, valuable things for the rest of the world. If we hold ourselves accountable and have the discussions around those, we can truly create value that creates a flourishing society. And that is, unfortunately, that is the sort of dialogue that is lacking. It's the sort of dialogue that the Freedom Party is all about and wants to see become a deep part of our political culture. It will take work to get there, but we must start that conversation. And shows like yours and the work that you do, Mr. G, is part of that process of translating our political culture into one that talks about important matters, not trivial ones.
Yes, and as Noelize said, I mean, things like that you have to put in the regulations. I mean, to me, it's such a, I mean, it's a no-brainer to say there must be debates among leaders. Let's know what it is that you have planned for the country. Let us see what stuff you are made of, right? But, you know, we have to also hold ourselves accountable, because, ladies and gentlemen, because, you know, the time has run out on us. We've reached the 10 o'clock hour. So I'm going to ask Boss, so give us your final remarks, Boss, on your closing remarks. I think your mic is muted, Boss. So you might have to unmute your mic.
Yes. I think we had a very good discussion tonight on this long overdue settlement of reform. And I hope, in the name of democracy, transparency, free and fair election in Dominica, we can settle this matter and settle it for good, and that the Labour Party would not see it as something that they want to take control of, but sees as something that we as citizens, whether we belong to Freedom, Labour, UWP, or civic groups, that we can sit down soberly and discuss, and we can find common ground to resolve these issues. And like was said earlier on, we paid $600,000, and therefore I don't think we should just take the whole report and throw it aside. We need to examine the report, focus more on the legislative recommendations to ensure what goes to Parliament in the interest of the country and democracy. And I would plead to the Prime Minister and his team to do not see it as an opportunity for them to take advantage of and to rush to Parliament to score points, because what you're doing, you're provoking people into unsettled anger. And I would also appeal for the Electoral Commission to be front and center in this discussion. We must never forget their role, because our forefathers, if they had leave the election to be controlled by the political parties, the incumbent in office would never lose election. That's why we have an independent body, ensuring that the process is fair and there's a level playing field for everybody who wants to participate, either for a party or as an independent candidate. So I want to thank you, Mr. G, and thank the viewers and listeners, and also thank Q95 FM Radio, and of course my colleagues for being here tonight. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you, boss. So, but let me just caution you a little bit. Whatever you do, do not harbor anything like I. There's an esteemed gentleman who said something about Eswa Malpapai. Was it Alvin Knight or was it Michael Douglas? One of those heavyweight fellas made that statement. But also, the man said he wants to be there for 50 years. You still have doubts about whether you think he really want to reform anything. You think he's working for him. He there working for him. He don't want to go anywhere. He said 50 years. It's not 50 years yet. Alvin, your final words?
Well, just to kind of respond to that, Mr. J, I always like to go back to that CCJ document. Um, Although some may argue it's not a decision, quote unquote, per se of the court, but they're very salient comments. As a matter of fact, I think the document itself is referred to somewhere as the, I think they call it the judgment of the justices, honorable, whatever, whatever, whatever. That's how it's referred to. At section 56, I always like to refer to it because it's a very important document and it speaks to exactly the conversation we're having. It says the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. This will shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections, which shall be by universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret vote or by equivalent free voting and procedure, unquote. And that is in italics. So that's from the CCJ. And they went on further to say, electoral lists are central to legitimate and lawful elections, full stop. I just want to end by saying that this is a people's matter. It's in my view now, it's in the hands of the people. Having said that, of course, there has to be focused leadership and discussion to the people. Focused leadership, direction, and discussion. And I welcome the opportunity by allowing that process as we have in here this evening. So thank you for that opportunity. I think we have to sit down in a very sober, unemotional way and look at all the ideas, let all the ideas contend. There's work to be done, but I don't think it's difficult. I think the foundation has been established. The framework is there. And I think we now need to build on that framework. And every one of us must ask ourselves and lend ourselves to that support. I think it was earlier this week on the program, Lennox made a very good point, talking about each and every one of us responsibility. And I think that's where we are at this stage of our history and our development. What are you, what each of us is prepared to do in order to get that electoral reform, which is for the people and by the people. So again, thank you, Lambi. Thank you to the rest of the colleagues on the panel and all the persons who have been tuned in. And just playing my little part in whatever little way I can. Thank you.
And you're doing a good job of it too, Alvin. Let me just go over to the, well, you know what we say, we always have among us, somebody spoke about what they used a while ago, sober and unemotional. I don't know about unemotional for ladies because sometimes they use that emotion for a lot of good. And out of that emotion comes a lot of great stuff. And sometimes we're moved by some of that emotion. But I mean, in terms of being sober, I listened to Noelize tonight, and I wanted to ask you now for your closing remarks, Noelize, because certainly you came across as very sober, very pragmatic, and I can see that you've read the law. I think I can see that you'd want to read it some more. But I noticed that you agreed with certain very pragmatic things that Dr. Andre had put out in his recommendations. To me, that's a good start. So let's go over to you for your final words.
Yes, Mr. G, yes, certainly I agree with some of the things that Dr. Andre has indicated, but I think like others have said, you know, many of the things that he has raised are things that probably for the long term and require constitutional change and so on. And we have to certainly look at it together, look at it. All Dominicans need to study this thing and see for themselves, has this legislation accomplished any of what we have been seeking for the past few years? And when we itemize those things and compare it against the legislation, then, then that's how we wait, and that's how we ought to wait. And I think the Freedom Party is here saying, it certainly doesn't score zero, but there is work to be done, and let us all put our heads together and do the work. Let us do the work. Let's not run away from it. Let's get in there, do the work. As Bernard says, do the hard work and make it work for us. Let's not shift the goalpost. Let's do the work and make the legislation something that we have been asking for all along, And that's it from me.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that, Noelize. Bernard, you have the final word, but as I go to you for the final words here tonight, it seems to me what is seems to be coming out of this is that, something, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Let's look at what is not good and take it out, throw it away. It's no good, extract it and throw it away. It's no good. We don't want that. But here's what we want. Let's put it in there. And maybe if some kind attorney somewhere who's knows something about drafting would assist us, put all of these good ideas that we have, these good intentions that we have, the good thing that we have, that we want to level the playing field and make our elections free and fair, put those provisions in the draft and say, okay, this is what we want. Put them in there and say to the Electoral Commission, to the government, to our Attorney General, to CARICOM, to the region, to OAS, and whoever, and say, these are the things that you yourselves have recommended that we put in our legislation to bring it up to par. And we are suggesting that we need your support on this, and we are asking the Electoral Commission to comment on it, and then to make, because under the law, I think they have an opportunity to comment on whatever legislation goes to Parliament before it is tabled in Parliament. That is what I understand the law. I stand to be corrected, but I understand that's what the law is. I mean, they cannot place law on table law in Parliament, but they certainly under the law have the opportunity to comment on it. Bernard, your thoughts as we close?
Yes, thanks, Mr. G. Again, I think my fellow panelists, my executive here has extended thanks to you and to the listening audience. So I'll just jump into, as you said, a few closing remarks. I would like to say, we should not allow this bill, let's be honest, has some promise, and we should not allow the DLP or the Labour Party government to use us. When I say us, I talk about the opposition forces, to kill any progress. We should not allow the DLP to use us against ourselves and our best interests. We should look at the bill, and we should not go throw it out, and the DLP says, well, we tried. You parley, sir, you path, they're not for progress, whatever. Moving on, big smiles, they're happy. We should not allow the DLP to use our emotion against us. What we have to do is to look at this bill, every inch of this bill, because it is easy to yell, it is easy to complain, it is easy to say, let us storm the castle. It is harder to do the work. And what we're about and what we should be about is doing hard work, because to displace this government will require hard work. We have to start now. We will do hard work to make this legislation work. We will have to do hard work to campaign. We will have to do hard work to convince the Dominican people that we have their best interests in heart and that we have the economic plans that will transform their lives. But all of these things take hard work. And in this process, we have to look at this bill and we have to fix this bill. We have to take ownership of this bill. We have to plug this bill. We have to draft legislation, suggest legislation to fix the gaps in this bill. I believe, my executive belief, the DFP believes that actually this legislation lays a good foundation and a good framework, and that with some hard work, we can make this bill a bill that passes in government, in the legislation, and advances and preserves some level of democracy improvement in Dominica. That is the position of the Dominican Freedom Party. It will take hard work. As I said, vast majority of the bill is acceptable. It is not non-consequential. The few things, the Dominican Freedom Party, along with our colleagues in the Electoral Reform Coalition and other interesting groups, we now need to go and sit down and do the hard work, close the gaps, and make this a bill that is palatable, that works, and a bill that we own in terms of our contribution to it, and propose and work with the government and not allow them to use us against ourselves to sabotage progress. And that is the progress. That is the next step in this process. And that is where the Freedom Party entails to be right in the middle of doing that hard work and educating the Dominican people to get a bill that works for us. So thanks again for the invitation to myself, to my party, and thanks for the listening public who have tolerated us for 2 hours. And hopefully we can continue the dialogue as a community.
As you say that, Bernard, and thank you for your closing remarks. I just want to acknowledge all the people who have been with us all this time on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you for being with us all this time and sticking with us. And thank you for the calls that we took. We didn't really get to take too many calls tonight. But Bernard, one of the things I don't want us to sort of build our hopes too high on. I mean, what I can see already happening is there is already a meeting of the minds around certain things that need to be in the appropriate laws by the time we get to it. And I can see minds already beginning to meet. And I'm very happy that Dr. Andre did the work that he did, because it gives us something to start with. We can see what we can accept, what we can add, what we can subtract, but it gives us something to work with and to build on. One of the things, however, I want to advise all of the political parties, all of the civic organizations, all the members of the ECR, all the church groups, all of the private sector organizations and so on, unions. Let us remind ourselves that after all this hard work is done, and if you were to get a new draft that includes now all of the good things that we want in there, and everybody agreed, yes, these are the things we want, these drafts now have that, this thing can be now tabled in Parliament. Let us not forget something. Because you mentioned the word fight. Because remember, anytime you put all those good things in there, is going to affect somebody's winning legacy. And they will resist it, because that is the reason why we are still talking electoral reform today. The Electoral Commission started doing it, and then the people on the board were changed, on the commission were changed in order to avoid that. So we have to remember the only way this will get tabled in Parliament, because it cannot be tabled by anybody else but the regime that's in office now, the administration. Only they can table it. And the only way you can guarantee to do that, if you can get a very large percentage of the population, whether through petitions or whether through mass gatherings, saying, listen, here is what we really want. And we peacefully ask that we get this. This is what we really want. Maybe people might be willing to put their signatures to a petition on exactly what you're talking about there. Maybe if you were to do that and the world can see that Dominica, the large majority of the Dominicans want, this is what they want, maybe we might get some sympathy out there, but nobody's going to come from anywhere and do it for us, Bernard, or Noelize, or Alvin, or Bosso. Nobody's going to come from us. We're going to have to do it ourselves. Or people have to be going to rally, or young people have to start thinking about their future and say, listen, you know something? This is the best way for us to go forward. And people have to say, we demand it. That is the only way I think that we will get it ultimately. So, gentlemen, I just want to thank you so much for being here tonight. I mean, it's a very nice, sober
And lady.
And I should say lady first, and gentlemen. Lady and gentlemen, right? I mean, really and truly, very nice. So somebody's talking to us. I'm just saying that it's a very nice, sober discussion. I like it. And I hope that we can see a lot more of the Freedom Party. I'll certainly invite you guys to come back again at some other time after we've gone further in this in this whole reform movement. And we can see next time when we come back, maybe we can see, okay, here, all of the opposition forces, all the civic groups and so on have agreed that is where we're going. And maybe we can come together and say, this is what we're really looking at going forward. So I'm looking forward to that day. I hope that works out. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Well, let me say, Mr. G, thank you. I want to thank you too for the work you're doing through this medium, Global View, and your radio station, Q95. Let's not stop. And we have to. We cannot do it today, don't do it tomorrow, do it another day. We have to be consistent and persistent on that electoral reform. So whatever it takes, we have to continue with that program. So we want to thank you, and we hope that that dialogue and conversation can continue until we get it done.
So what you're telling me, in other words, is only Alvin that can say finish with that. I can say it too.
I'll let Noelize answer that.
Alvin alone had that privilege to say, boy, I taking a back seat now. I done with that. Anyway, it's all good.
All right.
So,
Thank you.
good night,
Good
everybody.
night.
Noelize, take care.
Hey,
Nice.
good night. Good night.
All right,
Yes.
good night,
All
everybody.
right. All the best.
Good
right.
night, everyone.
Take it
Take
easy.
care.
Yes.
Until next
Yeah,
time. Bye bye.
yeah.
Look
Good
for,
night. Good
look
night.
forward to cricket tomorrow.
Oh
Well,
yeah, yeah.
let's hope the weather holds up.
Yeah, the weather a little up now, so it
Yeah,
might
let's
not
see
be
what happens
morning.
in the morning.
Yes.
All right.
All right,
Okay
guys.
then.
Okay,
Bye.
man.
Bye bye.
Take care.
Take care,
Thanks a
everyone.
lot. Good.
Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, no, 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 no. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. Looking out my window, and I'm a thinking of tomorrow, and I'm a wondering what the future will be. Thinking of the children who are the victims of oppression, beaten down by wars and eaten up by starvation. I'm saying, when there's ugly will be over, and the children can go out and play. I wanna see when all oppression will be done, and the people will rise up and say, freedom at last, freedom at last, so free, freedom has come, freedom has come, oh yeah. Shall have something in seclusion, and I'm in my meditation, and I can hear the voice of the sufferers cry for justice. Ooh, another ugly war is raging, threats of nuclear war is arising, and the world is gripped by fear of mass destruction. I'm saying, when there's ugly will be over, and the children can go out and play. I wanna see when all oppression will be done, and the people will rise up and say, freedom at last, freedom at last. So free, freedom has come, freedom has come, oh yeah, oh yeah. Mm-hmm. So much blood, say you turn sorrows. There is no future for the youths of tomorrow. Yeah. So many mothers crying, so many funerals. Oh, when we lead say when there's only will be over, and the children can go out and play. I wanna see when all oppression will be done, and the people will rise up and say, freedom must go. Ooh.
Citizens exploring free and fair elections.
Thought I found the right woman to ease my troubled mind. You said you would be there for me, baby, till the end of time. Thought I had a chance to start all over. Said you would be there every step of the way. But all I ever get, all I ever get is empty promises, baby. Empty promises, baby. As time went on, we stayed together. I knew you would never change, never change. Said you wouldn't break my heart like the others, and we would make it somewhere. Lord, I had a chance to start all over. Since you could be there every step of the way. But all I ever get, all I ever get ya is empty promises, baby. Empty promises, baby. If they promise his way back, if they promise his way back, you know I love you. You know I want you. Gotta have you, babe. Gotta have you, babe. Gotta have you, babe. Gotta have you, babe.
Something in motion, something you can't see. It requires devotion from those who truly believe. This is something you can't touch. This is something you feel. For some people it's too much. For some people it heals. This music is my healing. This music is my healing. Girls, I need some healing. 'Cause when this world upsets me, this music sets me free, yeah. Yeah, we stand in formation while they test and they see. They compile information and try to make us believe that there is something we can't touch, something we'll never feel. When I feel like it's too much, this music always reveals this is our healing. This music is our healing. God knows we need some healing. Yeah, 'cause when this world upsets me, this music sets me free. God only knows who will save us, who will save us now. Wow. They sit back and watch flowers turn to stone. We got this music. We got this music. We got this music. This music. We got this.
Because he was just passing by. Like, he had nothing to do with any of this. He just happened to be there at that point.
He was working as well in the building. So he was just coming to his shift. And it was very difficult to see afterwards the receptionist, because the receptionist insisted that he wants to continue to work. So the next day, the receptionist, you will find him there after he just saw the video of how his son was just blown off in front of him. Mm. And it was so hard for us to even look at him. And he said, just act like nothing happened. Let's continue our day. So it's hard to accept it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And after such a close shave, were you thinking it's time to leave?
Yeah. I mean, that was the beginning of my thoughts. Is like, this gone closer. Mm. I used to say it to my friend that this was like a circle of death. It used to be so big. You hear of someone in a province 300 kilometers from Baghdad, and he got shot. And then you hear it's in Baghdad. And then you hear it's in your neighborhood. And then you see it. So that cycle starts to shrink and shrink and shrink. So I feel like it was coming to my throat.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, just to talk a bit more about your journalism, your work, I mean, there was one particular story that you were involved in. This was after the capture of Saddam Hussein, and he was about to go on trial. And you got some extraordinary access at that point, didn't you?
Yes. I was like every other journalist who wanted to cover the trial, we wanted to have access to the lawyers who were defending Saddam Hussein, because they will be able to see Saddam Hussein in his cell. And I was speaking with a lawyer about another story. And then I said, do you know this person? He's called Khalil al-Dalami. We heard that he's going to be the representative of Saddam's defense committee. And he said, well, he's just standing there.
Oh, really?
And I said, are you kidding me? And he's like, yeah, this man with the yellow shirt. So I run to him.
Really?
I run to him because I was so excited. I mean, what a lucky break. And he said, who are you? What are you doing here? Is the American channel? You working with the traitors? And I'm like, and he's like, we need to kill her now. You're working with the traitors. And he literally was just about to grab his pistol.
He was serious.
Oh, if you see that man, he's no joke. He doesn't joke.
What are you doing at this stage then?
I didn't know what to do, you know, and my legs are just shaking. I couldn't even run. I was just freezing. And then within seconds, he stopped and said, you know what, actually, we don't need to kill her. We need her to tell the Americans what we think of them and what we think of their government. So you know what? Actually, we should speak to you. I'm like, oh, that sounds amazing. That sounds great. Yes, please, can we just... And then he said, you give me your number, and whenever you call me, I will pick up. And that's how I started having conversation with him. And I was on the phone with him all the time, getting access to Saddam's hunger strikes, how the guards were treating him, if there was any problems in the court, etc.
This is a goldmine for you. This is an inside track into what loads of people really want to know. But this also ended up causing you, I mean, a real problem, didn't it?
Yes, there was 13 lawyers who were defending Saddam Hussein and his brothers. And those lawyers start to be targeted by different militias. So one time, 2 lawyers, they were shot. One of them, he received a bullet in the head and he died immediately. And the second was injured. So I called the injured lawyer and he said, well, a helicopter is going to take me now to Baghdad airport and I'm going to leave the country. I have to leave the country now. And then he said, we believe that there are journalists who are actually leaking to different militias about our location, and that's how we were targeted. So he said, there's going to be a list of all journalists who we have access to, and your name is there.
So you were on a hit list?
I was on a hit list.
I mean, what do you do then? Because this is another level, isn't it?
It's another level when you know that you could be targeted as in you are in a group of people, but now you are on a hit list. It's different. And this takes me back to that death circle that is shrinking and getting closer to me. I just survived 2 suicide car bombs on the Hamra Hotel. I felt like I'm a cat. You just lost 1 life and now you're going to lose a second. And how many times do I need to cheat death? Every single day, I was dreading going back home. What if they come and try to kill me in my house with my family? What if they kill my family in front of me? What if they kill them and even leave me alive? How can I survive the guilt? I brought this to them, and that was on my head every single day. And I said, I have to leave.
You did manage to leave, didn't you? And you ended up in the UK on a student visa. I mean, it must have been pretty hard saying goodbye to your family.
It wasn't hard for me to say goodbye.
Really?
Because I felt I was a ticking bomb in my house. I felt finally the relief that nothing is going to happen to them because of what I do. And I think that helped me to say the quickest goodbye.
So you come to London and I guess on the face of it, you're safe, secure. Were you happy with things going well?
There were a lot of ups and downs. I mean, at the beginning, I was still trying to climatize. It was the calmness that I needed to get used to, the routine. For example, in Iraq, you never say to somebody, what are you doing on the 16th of July? There's no diary. People respond to you saying, well, if I'm alive tomorrow, I will come to you. That's how people plan things. I was still in that headspace. So it took me a long time to relax and wear high heels again without the fear of running. Took some good time.
I mean, your life takes lots of twists and turns. You start making documentary films, you go back to Iraq, and I know that you made some intense films, dangerous films about secret prisons in Iraq, about links between clerics and sex trafficking. I'm interested also in the fact that you could have done something very different. You could have been a journalist here. You could have told lots of stories, and yet you choose to still go back and put yourself in really dangerous situations.
I actually worked in London for a couple of years in kind of a newsroom, but I couldn't stand people on Friday night saying, oh my God, what are we going to do in the weekend? And I start to be less patient about people complaining about the tube. And I came back from a battle and I'm now sitting discussing the district line and the circle line, and it didn't feel right to me. And also there was a bit of guilt because I felt like I was a lucky person to escape, but doesn't mean I should forget what I left behind. And that was my way to say, I didn't abandon you. And because as well, I had the luxury of leaving after doing a story. So I felt I should use it in a good way.
You've been nominated 4 times for Emmys. You've won twice. You've won various awards. How did it feel getting that acclaim for your work?
The first award that you win, you feel amazing. And I moved to a happier, healthier place with a French husband.
Let's talk about him. Tell me about meeting your French husband.
Yeah.
You've got a huge smile on your face.
Well, when he first met me, he didn't know, of course, I speak French.
Right.
So he was trying to impress me with his French accent and French words. So
what was he saying to you?
Well, he was saying to me, he's going to hate me for this.
It's all right. We'll tell him not to listen.
We were chatting and then he said to me, you know, French literature, we have a lot of amazing artists. And I was like, oh, really? And he said, do you know someone called Albert Camus? And I was. So are you a follower of the romanticism or the surrealism or the naturalism? And he's like, oh my God, what have I said?
I was going to say, how long did you leave him in that terrible kind of misunderstanding that actually I know quite a lot about this?
I actually was so blunt about this. And he's like, oh my goodness, how bad is my luck today that I meet a journalist who actually studied French literature.
And he's trying to woo you with that. And it's like,
yes.
So were you impressed? Or were you thinking, nah?
I was quite charmed from the beginning. So
You rediscovered your French passion.
yeah, from the second date, we actually said, maybe one day we will have a daughter and we will call her Sophie. So I was joking about the accent and I was joking about everything. And then that became the reality. We ended up having a child and we call her Sophie.
Oh,
So every time I call her with a French accent. And it just makes me smile to even just say her name.
and I know that French music, culture, the literature became a really difficult thing for you for a while. Does this change your relationship with all of that?
It did, but it's a very gradual thing. So my husband, when I hear him talking to our daughter in French, it is sometimes difficult for me to go through this. But I'm gradually going back to it.
Yeah.
I want to be back again to that, my happy space. But now with a family, thousands of miles away from Baghdad, feeling safe again.
The award-winning Iraqi journalist Mace Al-Baya speaking to me in London. If you have thoughts to share about Mace's story, or if you'd like to comment on anything you hear on Outlook, it's easy to do. Our email is outlook@bbc.com. I'm Andrea Kennedy. The producer today was Mariam Maroof. Thanks for your time.
BBC World Service. And now, Witness History. Today, we're taking you back to 1974, when a Hungarian architect, Edna Rubik, invented a puzzle, which went on to sell more than 450 million cubes. In 2015, Dina Newman spoke to Mr. Rubik about how he came up with the idea and how it became a global phenomenon.
Mr. Rubik, Rubik, Rubik. Is your cube from outer space? Mr. Rubik, Rubik, Rubik. He got 3 sides, then lost his place. Mr. Rubik, Rubik, Rubik. He just twists your cube all day. This ain't my idea of child's play.
The Rubik's Cube took the world by storm in the 1980s when it hit the global market and became the world's best-selling puzzle. But initially, its creator, Erno Rubik, was not thinking of sales and exports. He wanted to design a useful teaching tool for his students at the Budapest College of Applied Arts.
I was lecturing architecture, design architecture, buildings, and for the students, the best way to teach them, not to tell them what to do, but to show them what to do.
Well, it all started like this.
I was interested about to create something that is mobile, simple, and contains some kind of task. I was working the very traditional regular forms, and I found many interesting ways what we can do with them and how we can transform them. And finally, I was falling in love with the cube as a form because it has very special qualities.
Playing around with blocks of wood and rubber bands, Erno Rubik created early versions of his cube. Once he got the individual pieces to move around the structure without falling apart, he was ready to test it out on his students.
They liked it very much, and they created interesting things as well. And it's a very interesting task. And I was searching different potential of the cube, and I believe finally that I was successful.
The cube's blocks could move in all directions, creating an almost infinite number of positions. So, when it was mixed up, it was incredibly hard to solve.
The task of what was formulated by the cube at the very first sight, it was very difficult.
So initially you could not solve your own puzzle?
Sure. At the first sight, you don't understand what you see. After you understood it, you are able to handle it.
For about a month, Erno Rubik experimented with his cube, twisting it this way and that, and noting the results. The process of reassembling the cube turned out to be utterly absorbing.
You can do it like meditation. The rest of the world disappears. So you are focusing. You need to be there. That's one thing. Other thing is when you are playing with the cube, you are recreating the cube in your mind.
Tell me, were you the first man in the world to solve Rubik's Cube?
Sure, that's a fact. I was really happy. So that was a really very enthusiastic moment when I found it, and I'm sure I'm not alone with this one.
And so then you shared it with your students, right? Did you show them how to do it?
No. In that time I had the feeling I don't want to take away the possibility to find your own solutions, to start from scratch, to feel the same satisfaction.
I think I've got the answer. All I need's a little paint to change the colors of the squares before I'm in restraints. If that don't work, I've got the tools to force that into place. Before the world goes crazy, I will save the human race.
It turns out that only about 1% of people can solve the puzzle without any help, though every position of the cube can be solved in 20 moves or less. So it made sense to publish solutions, which helped to generate more interest in the puzzle. The first fans of the cube were architects, designers, and mathematicians who showed it to their colleagues at international conferences. At this point, Mr. Rubik thought it might be a good idea to start mass production. But in the Hungarian communist-run economy of the 1970s, opportunities for business were limited.
In that time in Hungary, if somebody created something like a toy, it was a very big success if he was capable to sell 20, 30,000 pieces of it. There was no toy manufacturing industry. Hungary is a very small market. It was a planned economy, that means no advertising, really, no budget for do anything. It was, you can buy a toy in the toy shop. That was the book in the bookshop, and so on.
Mr. Rubik, what have you got against the same? Mr. Rubik, is that some kind of Russian name? Mr. Rubik, I think I'll sue for therapy. Your cubes are missed.
It arrived in the toy shop, and there was very few companies selling toys, and they ordered 5,000, and after a while, I ordered some more. People discovered it.
In the first 3 years, around 1 million cubes were sold in Hungary, which had a population of 10 million. With no advertising, it seemed nothing short of a miracle. But ironically, it was the country's communist-run economy that fueled the demand.
Partly because it was hardly available. It was a good business to buy some, take it abroad, and sell it there. In that time, the Hungarian currency was not a hard currency. It was limited how many dollars or Deutschmark or something else you are able to buy for 1 year.
So the cubes became the equivalent of hard currency.
Some kind of thing, yes.
Seeing that the cubes were selling well on the black market, Mr. Rubik found a US distributor. And in 1980, they signed the deal.
In that time, they say they will sell 1 million pieces, that sounds very promising and nice. And after that, in 3 years, they sold more than 100 million. And after that, they sold the company.
So they sold 100 million cubes, and then they sold the company and made a fortune.
Yes.
Did you make a fortune out of it?
I got my royalties, and I tried to find some way to save my interest, but it's very difficult. So it was difficult for example, for the American company. It's very difficult to protect yourself.
Over the next 4 decades, numerous copies and imitations, not always legal, flooded the market. Scores of entrepreneurs, meanwhile, made a fortune with cube-related ventures. Erno Rubik did not become a billionaire. However, he does not believe he lost out.
I am a fortunate person, I can say, so I believe that. I'm fortunate because if I'm doing something, I'm not calling it work. I enjoy what I'm doing. So that's, to live that way, you must be lucky.
Come in, my son. Welcome to the kingdom. Hey, it's real nice up here. What do you guys do all day?
Well, we play with these.
Dina Newman was speaking to Edna Rubik for that edition of Witness History, first broadcast in 2015.
This is the BBC World Service asking, can Bangladesh's clothing industry go green and still keep costs down?
Bangladesh has positioned itself as a country where clothes are made in a more environmentally friendly way. But green technology comes at a price. So who's paying for it?
Bangladesh's clothing conundrum at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or wherever you get your podcasts. In half an hour, Fukushima.
In March 2011, a tsunami topped the walls of the Fukushima facility, causing the most severe nuclear accident since Chernobyl. Former energy company executive Hurtault was supposed to ensure that accidents like this couldn't happen. 10 years later, he searches for atonement.
The newsroom is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 3 o'clock GMT. This is Oliver Conway with the newsroom. North Korea launches a suspected intercontinental ballistic missile. We'll ask why. The youngest follower of notorious death cult leader Charles Manson is released after more than half a century in jail.
The G7 wants to provide...
Russia is criticised for vetoing proposals to extend an aid operation in Syria.
What we have just witnessed, what the world has just witnessed, was an act of utter cruelty.
On the second day of the NATO summit, G7 countries are expected to ratify a long-term security arrangement with Ukraine. And later,
there was many videos also on the internet where the kids are watching on their phones. This really makes my heart melt.
Joy in Ukraine as Elina Svitolina beats the world number 1 at Wimbledon. First, a roundup of our top stories.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. The G7 countries are expected to ratify a long-term security arrangement with Ukraine on the second day of the NATO summit in Lithuania. It's been spearheaded by Britain. Here's our Europe editor, Katya Adler.
The G7 wants to provide more defense equipment and training exercises for Ukraine's military to accelerate intelligence sharing and bolster support for Ukrainian cyber defenses. Downing Street says the agreement sends a strong signal to Vladimir Putin. It's also designed to alleviate deep frustration in Kyiv that NATO failed during its summit to agree a clear path toward Ukraine joining the military alliance as a member. Some NATO allies, including the US, say they're wary of getting dragged into a military confrontation with nuclear power Russia if Ukraine becomes a member too soon.
On the sidelines of the first day's proceedings at the NATO summit, President Biden and his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan discussed further strategic cooperation between the two countries. They discussed both security and economic issues. Earlier, the US National Security Advisor said Washington would go ahead with the sale of F-16 fighter jets to Turkey. Matthew Miller is a spokesperson for the US State Department.
I will say a few things on behalf of the administration. One, as the National Security Advisor made clear, as the President has made clear, we do support the sale of F-16s to Turkey. And as the National Security Advisor said today, we will move forward with that sale, which we do understand needs to be approved by key members of Congress.
The talks came a day after Ankara dropped its objections to Sweden joining the military alliance. North Korea has fired a suspected ballistic missile into the Sea of Japan off its eastern coast. The North Koreans last launched a missile barely a month ago. Ben Lowings reports.
The Japanese Coast Guard said the missile appeared to have landed at 2:13 GMT in a location outside Japan's exclusive economic zone, about 550 kilometers east of the Korean peninsula. The incident comes a day after the authorities in Pyongyang expressed outrage at what they said were repeated incursions by US spy planes. US officials have denied that their planes have entered North Korean airspace. Washington does